In the gleaming heart of the galaxy, 4,000 years before the rise of the Empire, there existed a star system so prosperous, so cultured, so advanced, that it was called the Jewel of the Deep Core. 7 worlds united under one rule, endless wealth flowing through carbonite mines, libraries that held the wisdom of 10,000 generations, art, music, philosophy flourishing like nowhere else in the known galaxy. But something went wrong. Terribly, catastrophically wrong. Imagine standing in a throne room where the frozen corpses of beloved rulers hang on the walls like trophies. Their own children placed them there. Picture war droids specifically designed to hunt and slaughter Jedi Masters, unleashed during a sacred peace gathering. Envision a supernova consuming 3 entire star systems in moments, triggered not by nature, but by aristocratic sorcery gone mad. See a Jedi Knight so consumed by darkness that he murders his own brother with a lightsaber while their former lover watches in horror. This is not fiction. This happened. The Krath cult, born from boredom, nurtured by forbidden knowledge, empowered by the ghost of an ancient Sith Lord, and ultimately responsible for a war that nearly shattered the old Republic itself. 2 young cousins, unlimited privilege, 1 stolen book, and a darkness that would consume millions. How does a golden age collapse into nightmare in less than a decade? What transforms wealthy nobles into mass murderers? When does curiosity become corruption? Tonight we descend into one of the darkest chapters in galactic history, the rise and destruction of the Krath, a tale of ambition, betrayal, forbidden sorcery, and the terrible price of seeking power without wisdom. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the stories I bring you. Here's something interesting. 64% of you watching right now haven't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into Star Wars history, hitting that subscribe button really helps this channel grow and lets me bring you more of these epic tales. Drop a comment below telling me where in the galaxy you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love discovering who's joining us, whether you're winding down for bed or starting your day with some dark side history. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable under your blankets, maybe turn on a fan for that perfect background ambiance. And let's step together into the shadows of the Empress Teta system, 4,000 years in the past, where civilization's brightest stars were about to burn themselves out in the most spectacular and tragic way imaginable. The year's 3998, before the Battle of Yavin. The Galactic Republic stands at the height of its power, thousands of years old, stretching across countless star systems. The Jedi Order numbers in the tens of thousands, guardians of peace scattered throughout known space. It is an era of expansion, prosperity, and relative peace. But in the deep core, in a system named for the legendary warrior queen who united it millennia ago, something ancient stirs. The Empress Teta system, 7 worlds orbiting a bright yellow star. Empress Teta itself, the capital world, Koros Major, Kurek, Ronica, and 3 others, each contributing to a unified civilization of breathtaking achievement. Together, these 7 planets form one of the wealthiest systems in the entire galaxy. Walk with me now through the capital city of Sinagar. Crystal spires rise toward the clouds, catching triple sunlight and scattering it in rainbow cascades across marble plazas below. Repulsor vehicles glide silently between towers. Gardens overflow with flowers from 100 worlds, their perfumes mingling in warm afternoon breezes. Museums display artifacts from the earliest days of space travel. Libraries contain millions of texts, some dating back before the formation of the Republic itself. The carbonite industry drives this prosperity. Orbiting smelters process the mineral that preserves, protects, and powers countless technologies. The Carbonite Guild operates massive facilities, employing millions, generating wealth that flows endlessly into the system's economy. Art flourishes here. Musicians compose symphonies performed in concert halls of stunning beauty. The sculptors create masterworks displayed in public squares. Philosophers debate in academies, where students travel from across the galaxy to study. This is civilization at its peak, culture refined over generations, knowledge accumulated across centuries. The ruling family, House Keto, has governed with wisdom for longer than anyone remembers. The current rulers, Lord Keto and his sister Lady Magda Keto, are respected throughout the Republic. They balance commercial interests with public welfare. They fund the arts while maintaining security. They welcome alien species and celebrate diversity. Their children represent the future. Lord Keto's son, Setul Keto, is intelligent, curious, heir to half the system. Lady Magda's daughter, Alima Keto, is beautiful, charismatic, destined for leadership. These two cousins have every advantage: the finest tutors, unlimited resources, access to any education, any opportunity they could desire. They want for nothing, and that perhaps is the problem. I am a Jedi historian, standing now in the rebuilt archives of Sinagar, 4,000 years after the events I am about to recount. Around me are sealed cases containing artifacts recovered from those dark days. Krath masks with empty eye sockets, Sith amulets still radiating faint corruption, holographic records of atrocities that still make my hands tremble. I am joined by other archivists, former Jedi, who fought in those wars, survivors who remember when these beautiful streets ran red. Together we have been granted access to classified records, sealed testimonies, forbidden holocrons that document what happened here. What we discovered changes everything we thought we knew about the fall of civilizations. Because the Chryseid did not begin with evil. They began with boredom. Section 3. The Call to Adventure, 1300 words. The archives reveal their secrets slowly, reluctantly, as if the data cards themselves resist remembering what transpired. My fingers trace over a personal journal, recovered from the ruins of the Iron Citadel. The handwriting is elegant, practiced, belonging to someone educated in the finest schools. It belongs to Setul Keto, written when he was barely 20 standard years old. Another day of meaningless ceremony, he writes. Father droned on about carbonite production quotas, while mother smiled at diplomats who care only for their own profits. They call this leadership. I call it slow death by boredom. Alima agrees. There must be more to existence than this gilded prison. Privilege, we discover, can be its own kind of suffering. When every material desire is satisfied before you even think to want it, when every door opens at your approach, when every person you meet exists only to serve or flatter you, what remains? What challenge exists for those born at the summit? Setul and Alima were not alone in their restlessness. Around them gathered others of similar station. Young nobles with ancient family names and empty days to fill. They called themselves friends, but perhaps conspirators would be more accurate. They met in private chambers, away from parental oversight, away from tutors and protocol officers. At first, their rebellion took harmless forms, late-night gatherings, where they mocked the elder generation, parties that stretched past dawn, experimentation with exotic substances from distant worlds, the usual indulgences of wealthy youth throughout history. But Setul wanted something more, something forbidden. The Teta system had museums, you must understand. Institutions filled with artifacts from throughout galactic history, and among those carefully catalogued relics were objects recovered from the Great Hyperspace War, a conflict that had raged 1,000 years earlier. A war between the Republic and an empire of dark side practitioners called the Sith. Most citizens viewed these artifacts as historical curiosities, dead relics from a dead threat. The Sith had been extinct for a millennium. What danger could old amulets and encrypted manuscripts possibly pose? Satel thought differently. He saw those displays and felt something stir within him. A hunger he could not name. A fascination that bordered on obsession. He would stand before the cases for hours, studying the strange symbols carved into ancient metal, imagining the power these objects once held. Alima noticed her cousin's growing fixation, where others might have dismissed it as another passing fancy. She recognized something deeper. She had always been the more perceptive of the two, gifted with an intuition that allowed her to read people the way scholars read texts. And she read in Satel a genuine passion, perhaps the first real emotion he had felt in his entire pampered existence. "What if we learned their secrets?" she asked him one evening, as they stood together in the Museum of Teton Heritage. "What if we discovered what made them powerful?" It began as intellectual curiosity. They recruited other young nobles, forming what they called a secret society. They gave it a name, Krath, taken from ancient Teton mythology, a dark magician god from primitive times. The name felt deliciously rebellious, wonderfully transgressive. They studied what little public information existed about the Sith. They bribed museum workers for access to restricted archives. They pored over fragmentary texts that scholars had spent decades trying to decipher. Most of it proved frustratingly incomplete. The Republic had worked hard to erase Sith knowledge, to ensure their dark legacy would fade into harmless legend. But fragments remained, enough to tantalize, enough to obsess over. Satel discovered references to something called the Soul Stone, described as a tome of Sith teachings compiled by the ancient Dark Lords themselves. According to the records, this book had been seized after the Great Hyperspace War and placed in the Galactic Museum on Coruscant for study and safekeeping. The moment he learned of its existence, Satel knew he had to possess it. Talima tried to dissuade him at first. Stealing from the Galactic Museum was no small crime. They were heirs to a system, not common thieves. Discovery would mean scandal, disgrace, possibly criminal charges that even their family name could not shield them from. But Satel had already made his decision. With or without her support, he would go to Coruscant. He would find this book. He would unlock whatever secrets it contained. Alima studied her cousin's face and saw something she had never witnessed before in their years together: determination, purpose. For once in his aimless existence, Satel Keto wanted something desperately enough to risk everything for it. And so she chose to join him. The planning took weeks. They could not simply arrive on Coruscant and demand entry to the museum's most secure vaults. They needed cover stories, falsified credentials, carefully timed distractions. They needed to move through one of the galaxy's most surveilled locations without attracting attention. Satel proved surprisingly adept at deception. He had spent his entire life wearing masks, playing the role of dutiful heir when his mind wandered elsewhere. Now he simply wore a different mask, that of a young scholar researching Teton contributions to Republic history. The Galactic Museum welcomed them with appropriate deference. The heirs to Empress Teta, after all, represented significant potential donors. Curators competed to show them the most impressive exhibits. No one suspected that these two wealthy nobles had come to commit theft. It happened during an exhibition opening. The museum had organized a gala celebrating newly acquired artifacts from the Outer Rim. Senators mingled with academics, artists with military officers. Wine flowed, conversations echoed through marble halls. Security focused on protecting the new displays and managing the prestigious guests. No one noticed when Satel and Alima slipped away from the celebration. No one saw them descend into the lower levels where older, less glamorous artifacts gathered dust. No one observed as Satel produced a code cylinder he had acquired through means he never fully explained, granting them access to vaults that should have remained forever sealed. And there, in a climate-controlled case, resting on a pedestal, as if it were merely another historical document, sat the book they had traveled across the galaxy to find. The Soul Stone, bound in some material that was not quite leather, not quite metal, covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed peripherally, ancient beyond measure, radiating a presence that made Alima's skin crawl even through the protective case. Satel's hands trembled as he lifted it free. The security alarms should have screamed. According to the museum's own systems, nothing had been disturbed. The sensors registered no theft, no unauthorized access, nothing but two young nobles who had perhaps had too much wine and wandered where they should not have. Years later, Jedi investigators would determine that the book itself had hidden them, that it wanted to be found, wanted to be stolen, wanted to corrupt new vessels for the darkness it contained. They returned to the gala, the book hidden in a bag designed to shield its contents from scanners. They made their farewells, thanked the curators for a wonderful evening, and departed Coruscant on their private yacht as dawn broke over the endless city planet. Only when they were safely in hyperspace did they examine their prize. Satal opened the cover with reverence, eager to finally read the secrets that had obsessed him for months. The pages were filled with text in a language neither of them recognized. Not basic, not any of the common trade languages, not even the ancient dialects they had studied. This was something older, something that predated the Republic itself. Sith script, unreadable without a translator, or someone trained in the ancient dark side traditions. Satel's triumph curdled into frustration. They had risked everything to steal a book they could not even read. Alima watched her cousin's face cycle through emotions. Anger, disappointment, then something else, that same determination that had driven him to Coruscant in the first place. "There are those who can read this," Satal said quietly. "The Republic believes the Sith are extinct, but what if they are wrong? What if some survived, hidden in the Outer Rim, preserving their knowledge?" Alima knew where this was leading. She could see it in his eyes, hear it in his voice. "Onderon," she said. Satal nodded. The legend spoke of Onderon, a world in the Inner Rim that had once been ruled by a Sith Lord named Freedon Nad. 400 years had passed since his death, but rumors persisted of his followers, of dark side practitioners who still honored his memory. If anyone in the galaxy could read this book, it would be them. The decision made itself. They would not return home to Empress Teta. Not yet. Not until they had unlocked the secrets they had traveled so far to claim. Neither of them could have known that this choice, made in the privacy of their yacht as it hurtled through hyperspace, would doom their entire civilization. That the book in Satel's hands was not just an artifact but a trap set 1,000 years ago by Sith Lords who knew that darkness never truly dies. It simply waits for ambitious youth who mistake corruption for knowledge, who confuse power with purpose, who believe themselves strong enough to touch the void without being consumed by it. Satal and Alima set course for Onderon. Behind them, Empress Teta continued its peaceful existence, unaware that its heirs had just sealed its fate. Ahead of them, on a world wrapped in jungle and shadow, an ancient evil stirred from its centuries-long slumber. The ghost of Freedon Nad had been waiting, and finally, after 400 years, the perfect vessels had come to him. The archives reveal their secrets slowly, reluctantly, as if the data cards themselves resist remembering what transpired. My fingers trace over a personal journal, recovered from the ruins of the Iron Citadel. The handwriting is elegant, practiced, belonging to someone educated in the finest schools. It belongs to Sato Kito, written when he was barely 20 standard years old. "Another day of meaningless ceremony," he writes. Father droned on about carbonite production quotas while Mother smiled at diplomats who care only for their own profits. They call this leadership. I call it slow death by boredom. Alima agrees. There must be more to existence than this gilded prison. Privilege, we discover, can be its own kind of suffering. When every material desire is satisfied before you even think to want it, when every door opens at your approach, when every person you meet exists only to serve or flatter you, what remains, what challenge exists for those born at the summit? Seytal and Alima were not alone in their restlessness. Around them gathered others of similar station, young nobles with ancient family names and empty days to fill. They called themselves friends, but perhaps conspirators would be more accurate. They met in private chambers, away from parental oversight, away from tutors and protocol officers. At first, their rebellion took harmless forms, late-night gatherings where they mocked the elder generation, parties that stretched past dawn, experimentation with exotic substances from distant worlds, the usual indulgences of wealthy youth throughout history. But Seytal wanted something more, something forbidden. The Teta system had museums, you must understand, institutions filled with artifacts from throughout galactic history, and among those carefully catalogued relics were objects recovered from the Great Hyperspace War, a conflict that had raged 1,000 years earlier, a war between the Republic and an empire of dark side practitioners called the Sith. Most citizens viewed these artifacts as historical curiosities, dead relics from a dead threat. The Sith had been extinct for a millennium. What danger could old amulets and encrypted manuscripts possibly pose? Seytal thought differently. He saw those displays and felt something stir within him, a hunger he could not name, a fascination that bordered on obsession. He would stand before the cases for hours, studying the strange symbols carved into ancient metal, imagining the power these objects once held. Alima noticed her cousin's growing fixation. Where others might have dismissed it as another passing fancy, she recognized something deeper. She had always been the more perceptive of the two, gifted with an intuition that allowed her to read people the way scholars read texts. And she read in Seytal a genuine passion, perhaps the first real emotion he had felt in his entire pampered existence. "What if we learned their secrets?" she asked him one evening, as they stood together in the Museum of Tetan Heritage. "What if we discovered what made them powerful?" It began as intellectual curiosity. They recruited other young nobles, forming what they called a secret society. They gave it a name, Krath, taken from ancient Tetan mythology, a dark magician god from primitive times. The name felt deliciously rebellious, wonderfully transgressive. They studied what little public information existed about the Sith. They bribed museum workers for access to restricted archives. They pored over fragmentary texts that scholars had spent decades trying to decipher. Most of it proved frustratingly incomplete. The Republic had worked hard to erase Sith knowledge, to ensure their dark legacy would fade into harmless legend. But fragments remained, enough to tantalize, enough to obsess over. Seytal discovered references to something called the Soul Stone, described as a tome of Sith teachings compiled by the ancient Dark Lords themselves. According to the records, this book had been seized after the Great Hyperspace War and placed in the Galactic Museum on Coruscant for study and safekeeping. The moment he learned of its existence, Seytal knew he had to possess it. Alima tried to dissuade him at first. Stealing from the Galactic Museum was no small crime. They were heirs to a system, not common thieves. Discovery would mean scandal, disgrace, possibly criminal charges that even their family name could not shield them from. But Seytal had already made his decision. With or without her support, he would go to Coruscant. He would find this book. He would unlock whatever secrets it contained. Alima studied her cousin's face and saw something she had never witnessed before in their years together. Determination, purpose. For once in his aimless existence, Seytal Kato wanted something desperately enough to risk everything for it. And so she chose to join him. The planning took weeks. They could not simply arrive on Coruscant and demand entry to the museum's most secure vaults. They needed cover stories, falsified credentials, carefully timed distractions. They needed to move through one of the galaxy's most surveilled locations without attracting attention. Satal proved surprisingly adept at deception. He had spent his entire life wearing masks, playing the role of dutiful heir when his mind wandered elsewhere. Now he simply wore a different mask, that of a young scholar researching Tetan contributions to Republic history. The Galactic Museum welcomed them with appropriate deference. The heirs to Empress Teta, after all, represented significant potential donors. Curators competed to show them the most impressive exhibits. No one suspected that these two wealthy nobles had come to commit theft. It happened during an exhibition opening. The museum had organized a gala celebrating newly acquired artifacts from the Outer Rim. Senators mingled with academics, artists with military officers, wine flowed, conversations echoed through marble halls. Security focused on protecting the new displays and managing the prestigious guests. No one noticed when Satal and Alima slipped away from the celebration. No one saw them descend into the lower levels where older, less glamorous artifacts gathered dust. No one observed as Satal produced a code cylinder he had acquired through means he never fully explained, granting them access to vaults that should have remained forever sealed. And there, in a climate-controlled case, resting on a pedestal, as if it were merely another historical document, sat the book they had traveled across the galaxy to find. The Soul Stone, bound in some material that was not quite leather, not quite metal, covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed peripherally. Ancient beyond measure, radiating a presence that made Alima's skin crawl even through the protective case. Satal's hands trembled as he lifted it free. The security alarms should have screamed. According to the museum's own systems, nothing had been disturbed. The sensors registered no theft, no unauthorized access, nothing but two young nobles who had perhaps had too much wine and wandered where they should not have. Years later, Jedi investigators would determine that the book itself had hidden them, that it wanted to be found, wanted to be stolen, wanted to corrupt new vessels for the darkness it contained. They returned to the gala, the book hidden in a bag designed to shield its contents from scanners. They made their farewells, thanked the curators for a wonderful evening, and departed Coruscant on their private yacht as dawn broke over the endless city planet. Only when they were safely in hyperspace did they examine their prize. Satal opened the cover with reverence, eager to finally read the secrets that had obsessed him for months. The pages were filled with text in a language neither of them recognized. Not basic, not any of the common trade languages, not even the ancient dialects they had studied. This was something older, something that predated the Republic itself. Sith script, unreadable without a translator or someone trained in the ancient dark side traditions. Satal's triumph curdled into frustration. They had risked everything to steal a book they could not even read. Alima watched her cousin's face cycle through emotions. Anger, disappointment, then something else. That same determination that had driven him to Coruscant in the first place. "There are those who can read this," Satal said quietly. "The Republic believes the Sith are extinct, but what if they are wrong? What if some survived, hidden in the Outer Rim, preserving their knowledge?" Alima knew where this was leading. She could see it in his eyes, hear it in his voice. "Onderon," she said. Satal nodded. The legend spoke of Onderon, a world in the Inner Rim that had once been ruled by a Sith Lord named Freedom-Nad. 400 years had passed since his death, but rumors persisted of his followers, of dark side practitioners who still honored his memory. If anyone in the galaxy could read this book, it would be them. The decision made itself. They would not return home to Empress Teta, not yet. Not until they had unlocked the secrets they had traveled so far to claim. Neither of them could have known that this choice, made in the privacy of their yacht as it hurtled through hyperspace, would doom their entire civilization, that the book in Satel's hands was not just an artifact but a trap set 1,000 years ago by Sith lords who knew that darkness never truly dies. It simply waits for ambitious youth who mistake corruption for knowledge, who confuse power with purpose, who believe themselves strong enough to touch the void without being consumed by it. Satel and Alima set course for Onderon. Behind them, Empress Teta continued its peaceful existence, unaware that its heirs had just sealed its fate. Ahead of them, on a world wrapped in jungle and shadow, an ancient evil stirred from its centuries-long slumber. The ghost of Freedom Nad had been waiting, and finally, after 400 years, the perfect vessels had come to him. Onderon hung in the viewport like a green jewel wrapped in storm clouds. The planet's upper atmosphere churned with perpetual tempests, lightning dancing between towering thunderheads. Beneath that violent sky lay endless jungle, broken only by a single massive city surrounded by walls that had stood for thousands of years. Satel studied the approach vectors with unusual intensity. Normally he left such details to hired pilots, but something about this world demanded his full attention. Perhaps it was the way the Force users described it in the fragmentary texts he had read. A nexus of dark side energy. A wound in the fabric of reality that had never fully healed. Alima felt it too, though she lacked the vocabulary to describe what her senses were telling her. A pressure against her thoughts, a whisper just below the threshold of hearing. The closer they drew to Onderon, the stronger the sensation became. "Are you certain about this?" she asked her cousin, not for the first time since leaving Coruscant. Satel did not answer immediately. His hands rested on the soul stone, which sat between them on the navigation console. Even sealed inside its protective case, the book seemed to radiate wrongness, an object that should not exist, that violated natural laws simply by being. "We have come too far to turn back now," he finally said. "And I need to know what this book contains. I need to understand what they knew. What made them powerful enough to nearly destroy the Republic?" What he did not say, what perhaps he did not fully recognize in himself yet, was that need had become compulsion. The book had infected him, not with disease but with hunger, a hunger that could never be satisfied, only fed. Their ship descended through the storms. Rain hammered against the hull. Winds buffeted them hard enough to trigger proximity alarms. But Onderon's automated guidance systems caught them, pulled them down through predetermined corridors in the weather, and deposited them in a landing zone that sprawled across what had once been jungle but was now permacrete and landing struts. The year was 3998 before Yavin. At this precise moment, Onderon was not at peace. The planet had become the center of a conflict between its government and a rebellion of exiled warriors called Beast Riders. Jedi Knights had come to mediate. The Republic was watching. This was not an ideal time for two wealthy nobles to arrive seeking forbidden knowledge. But timing, they would discover, was not coincidence. Aziz rose before them as they disembarked. The city was a marvel of defensive architecture, walls stacked upon walls, each layer built on the ruins of previous iterations. Thousands of years of paranoid fortification had created a vertical metropolis where the wealthy lived in towers that kissed the clouds, while the poor huddled in shadows that never saw direct sunlight. Security officers met them at the spaceport, not with hostility, but with the careful attention any government pays to unexpected aristocratic visitors during wartime. Satel presented their credentials, heirs to Empress Teta, he explained, on a cultural research expedition studying pre-Republic civilizations. The officers accepted this explanation because they had no reason to suspect otherwise. Wealthy core worlders visiting Onderon for academic purposes was unusual but not unheard of. They were granted entry to the city, assigned a protocol officer to assist with their stay, and warned to remain within certain districts due to ongoing security operations. Satel had no intention of following those restrictions. He had done his research before arriving. He knew that Onderon's royal family traced its lineage back to Freedom Nad himself. He knew that the current monarch, Queen Aminoa, was rumored to practice dark side techniques in the depths of her palace. He knew that somewhere in this city were practitioners who could read the book he carried. What he did not know was that the Jedi had already arrived, that Master Jeth, one of the Order's most respected members, had sent 3 of his students to resolve the Beast Wars, that among those students was a young Jedi Knight named Ulic Keldroma, who would later become central to the Krath story in ways no one could have predicted. But that confrontation lay in the future. For now, Satel and Alima focused on their immediate goal, finding someone who could translate their stolen tome. Their protocol officer, a nervous young man who seemed perpetually worried about violating some obscure regulation, brought them first to their accommodations. A tower apartment in the noble district, all crystal and polished stone, with views across the city to the jungle beyond. Comfortable enough, but not their destination. "We need an audience with the royal family," Satel told the officer. "We bear greetings from House Keto to the throne of Onderon." This was not strictly true, as their parents had no idea they were on Onderon rather than returning home from Coruscant. But the claim carried enough plausibility that the officer agreed to submit the request through proper channels. While they waited, Alima explored the apartment. She found herself drawn to the windows, staring out at the jungle that pressed against Aziz's walls like a living siege. Somewhere out there were the Beast Riders, the rebels who had sparked this conflict. Somewhere beyond the city limits were predators that could tear apart a human in seconds. And deeper still, in places no map showed, were ruins from the time when Freedom Nad ruled this world with terror and sorcery. She felt the whisper again. That voice just below hearing, calling her, promising her things she did not know she wanted. "Do you hear it?" she asked Satel, without turning from the window. Her cousin joined her, and together they stood in the fading light, staring out at a world that seemed to stare back. "Yes," he said quietly. "I have been hearing it since we entered the system." Neither of them recognized the voice for what it was. The ghost of a dead Sith Lord reaching across 4 centuries of death, sensing in these 2 young nobles exactly what he needed. Fresh vessels, uncorrupted flesh, minds untrained in force resistance, ambition without wisdom, pride without understanding. Perfect tools for his long-delayed revenge against the Jedi who had finally defeated him. The audience with the royal family came sooner than expected. That should have been their first warning, that Queen Aminoa herself wanted to meet them, rather than delegating the task to some minor official, that she cleared her schedule, postponed other meetings, made time for 2 unknown nobles from a distant system. But Satel and Alima were too focused on their own agenda to notice the strangeness of their reception. They were brought to the throne room, near midnight, an unusual time for formal audiences. But the Queen's aide explained that Her Majesty kept irregular hours due to the ongoing crisis. The palace corridors were dimly lit, servants scarce. The deeper they went into the structure, the more Alima felt that pressure against her thoughts intensify. The throne room doors opened onto a scene from a nightmare. The chamber was vast, but shadows gathered in the corners despite dozens of glow panels. Queen Aminoa sat on her throne, but something was wrong with her. Her skin had a gray pallor. Her eyes reflected light like an animal's. When she smiled at them, her teeth seemed too sharp. "Welcome, children of Keto," the Queen said, and her voice carried harmonics that had nothing to do with proper speech. "We have been expecting you." Behind the throne, visible only to those who knew how to look, a figure stood, translucent, wearing armor from an ancient age, smiling with an expression of infinite patience finally rewarded. Freedom Nad had found his new apprentices, and in the shadows of the throne room, hidden from the young noble's awareness, another presence stirred. King Omin, the queen's husband, kept alive by dark side alchemy in defiance of all natural law, a man more machine than flesh, wrapped in metal and malice, eager to share his mistress's gifts with newcomers who sought the same power that had consumed him. The trap had been set centuries ago. Seitel and Alima had walked into it with eyes wide open, mistaking their doom for destiny. Queen Amanoa gestured, and servants brought forth a scroll, ancient parchment covered in the same script that filled the soulstone. She spoke words in a language the cousins did not recognize, and the symbols began to glow. "You wish to read the old texts," the queen said. "To understand the power that once ruled galaxies, this can be arranged, but such knowledge requires sacrifice. It demands transformation. Those who seek to touch the dark side must first allow it to touch them." Seitel stepped forward without hesitation. "We are willing." Alima watched her cousin volunteer them both for something they did not understand. She should have objected, should have recognized the danger, should have done anything except what she did. She stepped forward to join him. "We are willing," she echoed. Queen Amanoa's smile widened. Behind her, Freedom Nad's ghost laughed with genuine delight, and deep beneath the palace, in a chamber that had not been opened in 400 years, ancient mechanisms began to activate. The journey that had begun with boredom in a museum was about to transform into something far darker. The two young nobles from Empress Teta were about to receive exactly what they had asked for. They would learn to read the Soulstone. They would unlock its secrets. They would gain power beyond their most ambitious dreams. And in doing so, they would doom millions. But that night, standing in Queen Amanoa's throne room, with shadows gathering around them, and a ghost whispering promises they wanted desperately to believe, Satel and Alima Quito felt only triumph. They had found what they were seeking. They did not realize they were what had been sought. The education of Satel and Alima Quito began in blood. Queen Amanoa led them deep beneath the palace, through corridors that descended far below the foundations of Isis itself. Stone gave way to older stone. Worked passages became natural caverns. The air grew cold and stale, tasting of minerals and something else. Something that made Alima's throat constrict with instinctive revulsion. They passed chambers where beast skulls lined the walls like trophies. Rooms filled with artifacts that hummed with barely contained malevolence. Libraries where books bound in materials she hoped were not skin gathered dust that might have been ash. Each level took them further from the world of light and law, deeper into a realm where different rules applied. King Omin waited in the lowest chamber. The sight of him made both cousins stop involuntarily. He had been a man once. Perhaps he still was, technically, in the sense that a consciousness inhabited the wreckage, but most of what had been human was gone, replaced by a mechanical exoskeleton that kept his failing organs functioning and his broken spine upright. Tubes fed him nutrients, wires stimulated his atrophied muscles, and through it all, the dark side flowed, animating flesh that should have died years ago. "Do not be disturbed by appearances," the king rasped, his voice emerging from a vocabulator implanted in his throat. "What you see before you is the price of knowledge, and proof of its value. I should have died 2 decades ago. Instead, I endure. Power, children, that is what the Sith offer. Power over death itself." Seitel found himself unable to look away from this terrible exhibition. King Omin was a cautionary tale made flesh, a warning written in surgical scars and cybernetic implants. And yet, impossibly, Seitel felt not horror, but fascination. The king had chosen this existence. had traded mobility, comfort, normalcy for the chance to continue learning forbidden secrets. That dedication, that absolute commitment to knowledge regardless of cost, struck something deep in Sattel's core. "Show us," he breathed. "Teach us what you know." Omin's mechanical apparatus whirred as he turned to face them fully. Behind him, standing where no living being stood, Freeden Nad's ghost materialized fully for the first time. No longer a whisper or a shadow, but a presence, translucent yet undeniable, dressed in armor from an age when the Sith Empire stretched across thousands of worlds. "Finally," the spirit said, and his voice carried the weight of 4 centuries of waiting. "Finally, vessels worthy of my teaching arrive. You children of privilege and ambition, you who have tasted wealth and found it empty, you who seek meaning in a meaningless existence, I can give you purpose." Alima felt something shift inside her, a door opening that she had not known existed. The ghost's words resonated with truths she had never spoken aloud, fears she had hidden even from Sattel, that her entire life had been performance without substance, that beneath the beauty and charm and noble breeding lay nothing of value, that she was, fundamentally, hollow. Nad sensed her vulnerability the way predators sense wounded prey. "I can fill that emptiness," he promised. "I can make you matter, not because of your name, or your wealth, or your family lineage, but because of what you become, what you choose to become." The seduction was masterful. Not crude promises of power, though those would come, not threats or coercion, though those tools waited in reserve. Instead, Nad offered meaning, purpose, the chance to be significant in ways that had nothing to do with accident of birth. Queen Amanoa produced the Soul Stone. She opened it to a page marked with a ribbon that looked disturbingly organic. The symbols there glowed faintly in the darkness, and Omin began to speak. He read the ancient text aloud, translating from Sith into Basic. The words described techniques for manipulating perception, for crafting illusions so convincing that they became temporarily real, not mere tricks of light and shadow, but impositions of will upon reality itself. Sattel listened with absolute concentration, memorizing every syllable. Alima found herself understanding on a level that transcended mere intellectual comprehension. The techniques made sense to her in ways they did not for her cousin, where Sattel would need to study and practice. She instinctively grasped the principles. It was, Nad realized with satisfaction, because she was naturally gifted in the Force, raw, untrained, unaware of her own potential, but powerful. Given proper instruction, she could surpass even her cousin in the dark arts. "Try it," Queen Amanoa urged, gesturing to a small lizard that scuttled across the chamber floor. "Reach out with your feelings. Impose your will upon the creature. Make it see what you wish it to see." Alima extended her hand, following the instructions Omin had read. She visualized in her mind a predator, something the lizard would instinctively flee. And then, with an effort that felt like pushing against a heavy door, she projected that image outward. The lizard shrieked and bolted for a crevice in the wall, fleeing from a threat that existed only in Alima's imagination and its own terrorized mind. It was such a small thing, a parlor trick that harmed nothing. And yet Alima felt exhilaration beyond anything in her previous experience. She had reached beyond herself and touched the world. She had made something happen through will alone. Nad's ghost smiled. The hook was set. The lessons continued for days. Sattel and Alima returned to their apartment, each dawn, exhausted but exhilarated, sleeping through the daylight hours and returning to the palace depths each night. They told their protocol officer they were researching Onderonian history in the royal archives. Not entirely untrue, though the history they studied was of a sort no Republic scholar would acknowledge. King Ormond taught them the theory. The philosophy that underpinned Sith practice, that the Force was not some mystical energy field to be served and respected, as the Jedi claimed, but a tool to be exploited. That power belonged to those strong enough to seize it. That compassion was weakness, and attachments were chains. Queen Aminoa demonstrated techniques. She showed them how to draw on anger for strength, how to convert fear into focus, how to weaponize emotions the Jedi spent lifetimes learning to suppress. She was a patient teacher, correcting their mistakes with neither cruelty nor kindness, treating their education as a craftsman treats the forging of a tool. But Freedon Nad provided something more fundamental. He rewrote their understanding of reality itself. Through hours of conversation conducted in that chamber beneath Aziz, while the world above remained ignorant of their transformation, the ghost systematically dismantled every moral framework the cousins had inherited. Right and wrong, he explained, were constructs imposed by the weak to restrain the strong. The Jedi preached self-denial because they feared what would happen if Force users embraced their full potential. The Republic maintained order through laws that served the mediocre majority at the expense of exceptional individuals. "You are exceptional," Nad told them repeatedly. "You possess abilities that perhaps one being in a billion is born with, and you are supposed to suppress those gifts. Pretend to be ordinary. Serve beings fundamentally inferior to yourselves. This is the great lie that maintains galactic civilization. The talented are taught to sacrifice themselves for the benefit of those without talent." It was seductive philosophy, particularly to two young nobles who had spent their lives simultaneously privileged and purposeless. Nad was offering them not just power, but justification, permission to be what they secretly believed themselves to be, superior. The turning point came on the seventh night. Onderon's political situation had deteriorated while they studied. The Beast Riders were preparing a final assault on Aziz. The Jedi were mediating between the factions. Violence erupted in the streets above as loyalist forces clashed with rebel sympathizers. In the chaos, Queen Aminoa made her move. She attempted to assassinate the Jedi Knights and seize absolute power. But she had underestimated her opponents. Master Arca Jeth arrived with reinforcements. The Queen's dark side powers proved insufficient against trained Jedi. In the throne room where Sattel and Alima had first met her, Queen Aminoa fell. The Jedi could sense the dark side nexus beneath the palace. They descended into those forbidden chambers, intent on cleansing the corruption that had infected Onderon's royal family for generations. Freedon Nad made a decision. Aminoa had failed him. Aminoa's dying, his cybernetic systems damaged in the fighting, unable to sustain his body much longer. The ghost needed new vessels, younger, stronger. From outside Onderon's political complications, he needed Sattel and Alima. "Take what you have learned," Nad commanded them, as Jedi lightsabers illuminated the upper corridors. "Take the artifacts I have prepared, return to your home world. Build what Aminoa could not, an empire of the dark side, but one that does not make her mistakes, one that understands the true nature of power." He pressed into their hands Sith amulets, objects of terrible potency that had rested in Omin's vaults for 4 centuries. The metal was warm, despite the chamber's chill, almost alive against their skin. "These will protect you from Jedi detection," the ghost explained. "They will amplify your abilities. They will mark you as my chosen. Now go, before the Jedi sense your presence." Sattel and Alima fled. Through secret passages that Nad's ghost revealed, past chambers the Jedi would not reach for hours yet. Up through the palace and out into the chaotic streets where fighting made movement difficult to track. Their ship waited at the spaceport. They launched as Isis burned behind them. As Jedi finally penetrated to Omin's sanctum and found him dying among his machines, as Freedon Nad's physical remains were discovered and prepared for final proper destruction. But the ghost himself had already departed. He rode with the two Keto cousins, invisible to scanners, undetectable to any instrument the Republic possessed. He whispered to them during the journey home, teaching them even in hyperspace, preparing them for the role he had spent centuries waiting to fill. By the time their ship entered the Empress Teta system, Satal and Alima were no longer the bored nobles who had departed weeks earlier. They had been educated in secrets the Jedi thought forever buried. They wore amulets that granted them protection from the Order's sight. They carried knowledge that could topple governments. And they were ready, so ready, to put that knowledge into practice. Freedon Ned had chosen well. In these two young aristocrats, he had found exactly what he needed: the wealth to fund a movement, the social position to gather followers, the ambition to attempt what others would consider madness, and most importantly, the fundamental emptiness that made them desperate enough to fill themselves with darkness. The Krath was about to be born, not as a secret society playing at forbidden knowledge, but as a true Sith cult armed with ancient power and modern resources. Empress Teta awaited its heirs, unaware that they returned not as children, but as something far more dangerous. The ghost smiled as their ship descended towards Sinagar. 400 years of patience was about to be rewarded. The Jedi thought they had destroyed him on Onderon. They would learn how wrong they were. Through Satal and Alima, through the cult they would build, through the war they would unleash, Freedon Nad would have his revenge. The greatest tragedy was how eager his tools were to be used. Sinagar had not changed in their absence, but Satal and Alima returned as different beings entirely. The city's crystal towers still caught the light in prismatic cascades. The gardens still bloomed with flowers from 100 worlds. Citizens still went about their lives in comfortable ignorance of anything beyond their next meal, their next entertainment, their next petty concern. Looking down at the city from their private transport, Alima felt something she had never experienced before: contempt. These people who had everything and appreciated nothing, who lived in paradise and complained about trivialities, who possessed no ambition beyond comfort, no drive beyond pleasure. "They are cattle," Satal murmured beside her, and she realized he felt the same disdain. Freedon Nad's voice whispered approval from the space between spaces where ghosts dwell. His teachings had taken root deeper than even he had anticipated. The cousins were not merely corrupted, they were transformed, remade into something that could no longer coexist with the civilization that had birthed them. Their parents summoned them immediately upon learning of their return. Lord Keto and Lady Magda had questions about the extended absence, the vague communications, the unexpected detour to Onderon. They wanted explanations, reassurances that their heirs had not embarrassed the family name with inappropriate behavior in foreign territory. Satal and Alima attended the family dinner with perfect courtesy. They smiled at appropriate moments, laughed at their father's jokes, expressed interest in the carbonite production reports and diplomatic minutiae their mother considered important. They performed the roles they had played their entire lives with practiced ease. But beneath the performance, something had fundamentally changed. They were no longer playing at rebellion. They had tasted real power. They had been chosen by a Sith Lord's ghost for a purpose that transcended anything their parents could imagine. And they knew with absolute certainty that Lord Keto and Lady Magda would never allow them to pursue that purpose. Their parents represented everything Nad had taught them to despise: complacency, conformity, the worship of stability over greatness. They were obstacles to be removed, not authorities to be obeyed. The Krath had grown during their absence. What had begun as a handful of bored nobles seeking thrills had evolved into something more organized. Satal and Alima found dozens of young aristocrats eager to join their society, hungry for the sense of purpose and belonging it offered. These were the children of privilege who felt the same emptiness, the same desperate need for meaning in lives that lacked any real challenge. Satel began teaching them what he had learned on Onderon. Not the deepest secrets, not yet, but enough to hook them. Simple illusions, minor manipulations of perception, techniques that felt like magic to those who had never touched the Force before. Alima discovered she had a gift for recruitment. She could identify the vulnerable, the dissatisfied, the ambitious. She knew exactly what promises each person needed to hear. Some craved power, others wanted belonging. Still others simply needed permission to be cruel, to indulge the darker impulses that civilized society demanded they suppress. Within weeks, the Krath numbered over 100, within months, several hundred, all drawn from Teta's noble families, all sworn to secrecy, all convinced they were part of something revolutionary. But Satel and Alima knew that secret societies operating from the shadows had limited power. True transformation required control of the system itself. They needed to rule Empress Teta openly, not whisper in corners, which meant their parents had to die. The plan came together with disturbing ease. Lord Keto and Lady Magda maintained a regular schedule of inspections, visiting the various industrial facilities that sustained Teta's economy. One such inspection was scheduled at an orbital carbonite smelter, one of the massive platforms that processed the mineral in zero-gravity conditions. Security at these facilities was substantial but predictable. The ruling family traveled with royal protectors, elite guards trained to counter any conventional threat, but the Keto family had ruled in peace for generations. The protectors were ceremonial as much as functional. They had forgotten how to recognize real danger. They certainly did not know how to counter Sith sorcery. Satel arranged for their tutor, a man named Chorus, who had educated them since childhood, to accompany them to the smelter. Chorus was elderly, loyal to the family, utterly harmless, or so everyone assumed. In truth, Satel had been practicing on Chorus for weeks, testing techniques, learning how to reshape living flesh with the dark side. The tutor had become a guinea pig for experiments in Sith alchemy. His body gradually transformed, while his mind remained trapped and aware inside the changes. The orbital facility hung in space above Empress Teta, a sprawling complex of processing chambers and containment fields. Molten carbonite flowed through transparent tubes, glowing orange against the black of space. Workers moved through the facility in environmental suits, monitoring systems that had operated flawlessly for decades. Lord Keto and Lady Magda arrived with appropriate ceremony. Chairman Bearers of the Carbonite Guild greeted them with the nervous enthusiasm of a man whose livelihood depended on the ruler's continued satisfaction. Everything proceeded according to protocol, until Satel and Alima's shuttle docked. They emerged accompanied by Chorus, and immediately the atmosphere changed. Workers felt it first, that pressure against their thoughts, that whisper of wrongness that made instinct scream, warnings rational minds could not process. The chairman's smile faltered. The royal protectors shifted stance, hands moving toward weapons they could not quite justify drawing. Lord Keto studied his son and niece with growing concern. Something in their eyes had changed, something fundamental. "Children," Lady Magda began, "what is the meaning of this unexpected arrival?" Satel smiled. It was not a human expression. It was something wearing humanity, like a mask. "We thought it was time you met our tutor's new form," he said. Alema gestured and Chorus opened his mouth. What emerged was not a tongue but a writhing Adigan eel, a serpent of dark side energy that had once been human tissue. The old man's eyes screamed silently, begging for death, for release from the abomination his body had become. Lady Magda's hand flew to her mouth in horror. Lord Keto shouted for the royal protectors to seize his son and niece immediately. The guards moved forward, weapons drawn. but they were far too slow. Alima's training on Onderon had focused on illusions, and she had practiced obsessively during the return journey. Now she unleashed what she had learned. The Protectors saw not 2 young nobles but an army of Sith warriors, thousands of them surrounding them from all sides. Their minds could not process the impossibility. Their training failed against threats that violated reality. They froze, overwhelmed, useless. Satel and Alima advanced on their parents. Behind them, through the transparent walls of the smelter facility, other Krathi members were arriving. Dozens of young nobles in dark robes, faces hidden behind masks that transformed them from individuals into a unified movement. "You built a comfortable prison and called it paradise," Satal told his father. "You taught us to be content with meaninglessness, to accept limitation, to worship stability above all else. We are going to build something better," Alima added, her voice carrying a harmonics that had nothing to do with natural speech. "An empire not of comfort, but of power, not of peace, but of purpose." Lord Keto tried to reason with them, tried to reach the children he remembered beneath the strangers they had become. Lady Magda begged them to stop, to remember who they were, to recall the love they had shared as a family. But Satel and Alima had been taught by Frida Nad that love was weakness, that family bonds were chains, that mercy was for the inferior. They forced their parents toward a vat of molten carbonite. The same substance that had built the family fortune was about to become their execution method. The symbolism was not accidental. Lord Keto fought. He was not young, not trained in combat, but he was still strong enough to resist. The royal protectors remained frozen by Alima's illusions, seeing horrors that did not exist while ignoring the real atrocity unfolding before them. The carbonite was not meant for living beings. The process used for preservation and freezing required precise temperature control, gradual immersion, careful preparation. What Satel and Alima did to their parents was not preservation. It was murder by immolation. Lady Magda died first. The molten metal engulfed her, hardening instantly, trapping her final expression of betrayed love in carbonite that would last for millennia. Lord Keto died reaching toward his son, his last living moment spent trying to understand how the child he had loved could have become this monster. Satel felt nothing as he watched his father's hand freeze in mid-reach. No guilt, no hesitation, no human emotion at all. Frida Nad's teachings had burned those weaknesses away, leaving only purpose. The frozen corpses were transported back to Sinagar. Satal and Alima ordered them displayed in the Iron Citadel, the palace that had been their childhood home, mounted on the throne room walls like trophies, a message to anyone who might question the new order. The Krath revealed itself to the Empress Teta system not as a secret society, but as its new government. Satel and Alima declared themselves rulers, heirs by blood and conquerors by strength. The other noble families, infiltrated by Krath members, offered no resistance. Those few who might have objected were shown the frozen rulers and reconsidered their positions. Within days, the transition was complete. Within weeks, the Krathi had restructured Tetan society according to Sith principles. Art that celebrated peace was destroyed. Philosophy that preached compassion was banned. The entire educational system was revised to glorify strength and punish weakness. Citizens who resisted found themselves subjected to public executions that served as both punishment and entertainment. Satel proved particularly inventive with the various methods of death the dark side enabled. Alima used her illusions to make the condemned experience every possible horror before their actual demise. The Empress Teta system, jewel of the deep core, paradise of culture and learning, transformed into a nightmare in less than a year. And Frida Nad watched it all with satisfaction. His revenge against the galaxy that had destroyed him was beginning, Through these two corrupted nobles, he would build an empire of darkness that would make the old Sith seem merciful by comparison. The blood coup was complete, the Krath ruled openly, and the Republic, distracted by 1,000 other concerns, failed to recognize the threat until far too late. The transformation of the Empress Teta system under Krath rule was swift and absolute. What had taken generations to build was dismantled in months. Institutions that had stood for centuries were gutted and rebuilt according to Sith philosophy, and the citizens, to their eternal shame, adapted rather than resisted. Fear is a powerful tool for social control. Satol and Alima understood this instinctively, guided by Friedenad's centuries of accumulated knowledge. They made examples of the prominent, the influential, the respected professors who had taught Enlightenment philosophy, were burned alive in their own lecture halls. Artists who had created works celebrating peace were forced to destroy their creations before being executed. Religious leaders who preached compassion were crucified on the palace walls. The message was clear. The old ways were dead. The Krath ruled now, and dissent would not be tolerated. But terror alone could not sustain a government. Cecil proved surprisingly adept at administration, reorganizing Tessa's economy to fund the military expansion he envisioned. The carbonite industry shifted from commercial production to weapons manufacturing. Factories that had built consumer goods retooled to produce war droids. The wealth that had purchased art now purchased armies. Alima focused on what she termed spiritual transformation. She established Krath temples on each of the 7 worlds, massive structures built with resources confiscated from the old noble families. These temples served multiple purposes. They were centers of dark side indoctrination, where new recruits learned Sith techniques. They were administrative hubs from which Krath officials governed their territories. And they were nexuses of corruption, locations so thoroughly saturated with dark side energy that merely entering them could twist susceptible minds toward malevolence. The architecture reflected their purpose. Where Teton buildings had traditionally featured open spaces and natural light, the temples were labyrinths of shadow and oppressive stone. Where old structures celebrated beauty, these new constructions radiated menace. Gargoyles that were not quite architectural features leered from cornices. Symbols that hurt to look at directly marked every surface. The temples announced to anyone with eyes to see that something fundamentally wrong had taken root in the Empress Teta system. The Krath military grew with disturbing speed. Young nobles who had joined the cult for philosophical reasons found themselves conscripted into its armed forces. They were given a choice that was not really a choice at all. Serve the Krath Holy Crusade willingly, or serve it unwillingly after watching their families die. Most chose the former. Satel's greatest military innovation was the Krath war droid. These machines were specifically designed to counter Jedi Knights, incorporating lessons learned from millennia of Sith conflicts with the Order. Traditional battle droids moved predictably, attacked straightforwardly, and could be outmaneuvered by anyone with force-enhanced reflexes. The Krath droids were different. They moved like predators, hunched and rapid, their gyroscopic systems allowing impossible changes in direction. They attacked in coordinated swarms, systematically identifying and overwhelming the most dangerous opponents first. Most importantly, they carried weapons designed to penetrate Jedi defenses. Pulse wave technology that disrupted lightsaber deflection, melee blades forged from materials that could withstand energy weapons, and programming that made them willing to sacrifice themselves if it meant taking a Jedi with them. Mass production began within 6 months of the coup. The first 1,000 droids rolled off assembly lines that had previously manufactured mining equipment. By the end of the first year, production had reached 10,000 units monthly. Satel planned to field an army of hundreds of thousands, enough to overwhelm any force the Republic might send against him. The human element of the Krath military received special training and equipment. Soldiers were subjected to dark side indoctrination that rewired their moral centers, transforming ordinary citizens into fanatics who welcomed death if it served the cult. They were given armor that was both practical and symbolic, combining protective materials with designs intended to inspire terror in their enemies. The holy battle armor, reserved for elite guards assigned to temple duty, went beyond mere protection. The suits incorporated Sith alchemical processes that enhanced the wearer's strength and endurance while gradually corrupting their physical form. Guards who wore the armor for extended periods found their bodies changing, becoming something not quite human anymore. They accepted this transformation willingly, viewing it as ascension rather than degradation. Female Krath members who showed particular aptitude for Sith sorcery were designated Death Witches. Alima trained them personally, passing on the illusion techniques she had mastered. These women became psychological warfare specialists, deployed ahead of conventional forces to break enemy morale before battle was even joined. They could make soldiers see their worst fears manifest, make commanders doubt their own perceptions, turn allies against each other with carefully crafted hallucinations. The Death Witches wore masks that covered their entire faces, transforming them from individuals into identical vessels of darkness. The masks served a practical purpose, protecting their identities so they could operate covertly. But they also served a psychological function, erasing the humanity that might have otherwise restrained them from atrocity. Satel developed his own specialization, focusing on Sith alchemy rather than sorcery. He became expert at creating poisons that affected not just the body but the spirit, toxins that could corrupt a victim's connection to the Force itself. He crafted weapons that inflicted wounds which resisted healing. He experimented on prisoners, testing the limits of what organic life could endure before dissolution. His laboratory beneath the Iron Citadel became a chamber of horrors where screams echoed through ventilation systems into the levels above. Palace staff learned not to investigate those sounds, not to question what happened in the depths, not to acknowledge the occasional prisoner who stumbled out, transformed into something that begged for death but could not die. The year 3997. Before Yavin marked the official beginning of what the Krath termed their Holy Crusade. The name was deliberate mockery of religious concepts, transforming sacred terminology into instruments of terror. There was nothing holy about the campaign except in the sense that it was wholly dedicated to spreading corruption. The crusade began not with external conquest, but with internal purification. The Satel declared that anyone who harbored loyalty to the old government was an enemy of the state. Citizens were encouraged to report their neighbors, their co-workers, their own family members for thought crime. The accusations flooded in, driven by genuine zealotry in some cases and opportunistic revenge in others. The accused were given show trials where confessions were extracted through torture and Sith compulsion. The guilty were executed publicly in Synagogue's central plaza, events that drew crowds of thousands. Some watched out of morbid curiosity. Others attended because failing to appear might itself draw suspicion. And some, most disturbingly, genuinely enjoyed the spectacle. Public executions became regular entertainment, scheduled twice weekly like sporting events. Methods varied. To maintain audience interest, some victims were frozen in carbonite, like the murdered rulers. Others were subjected to Sith lightning until their nervous systems burned out. Still others were given to the Death Witches as practice subjects, dying slowly as illusions convinced them they were experiencing progressively worse torments. Children were brought to watch. Education officials declared that exposure to capital punishment was necessary for moral development, teaching the young what happened to enemies of the Krath. Families who objected found themselves among the accused at the next execution. The objections stopped. With internal opposition crushed, the Krath turned outward. The 7 worlds of Empress Teta were merely the beginning. Satel envisioned an empire spanning the deep core, then the core worlds, eventually reaching across the entire galaxy. It was an ambitious plan bordering on delusional, but delusion fueled by dark side power can accomplish terrible things. The first external targets were neighboring systems that had economic ties to Empress Teta. These were wealthy worlds, softened by generations of peace, defended by security forces that had never fought actual wars. The Kryci military overwhelmed them in days. Conquest followed a predictable pattern. Krath war droids would deploy first, targeting defensive installations and government centers. Death witches would sow panic among the population, with illusions of invading armies far larger than reality. Then conventional forces would arrive to mop up resistance and establish occupation. Populations were given a choice: swear loyalty to the Krath, accept their philosophy, worship at their temples, or die. Most chose survival. Some chose defiance and were made examples. A few, disturbingly, chose the Krath enthusiastically, joining the cult with genuine fervor. Alima discovered that darkness was contagious. Each world they conquered provided new recruits who could be trained and deployed against the next target. The Krath grew not just through reproduction but through conversion, a spreading infection that consumed entire populations. Within 6 months, the Krath controlled over a dozen star systems. Within a year that number had tripled. The Republic finally began to notice, but bureaucratic inertia and political infighting delayed any coordinated response. Senators from threatened regions demanded intervention. Senators from secure territories saw no reason to spend resources on distant problems. The Jedi urged action, but the Order had been diminished by centuries of peace and lacked the numbers to counter a full military campaign. Satel and Alima grew increasingly confident. They had transformed from bored nobles into warlords commanding real power. They ruled an expanding empire. They wielded abilities that made them nearly unstoppable against conventional opposition. And they had forgotten, if they ever truly understood, that every empire built on darkness eventually faces the light. The Jedi were watching. The Republic was mobilizing, and neither institution would allow the Krath to continue unopposed. The collision was inevitable. The only question was where and when it would occur, and how many would die in the resulting cataclysm. The Jedi had been aware of the Krath for months before taking action. Individual knights reported disturbances in the Force emanating from the Empress Teta system. Scout ships observed military buildup and aggressive expansion. Refugees from conquered worlds brought stories of atrocities that defied belief. But awareness and action are different things. The Jedi Order of 4,000 years before Yavin was not the centralized institution it would later become. Masters operated independently across the galaxy, answering to the Council only for the gravest matters. Coordination required consensus, and consensus required time that the Krath's victims did not have. The turning point came when a Republic task force attempted to liberate one of the occupied systems. The fleet was substantial, 36 warships supported by fighter squadrons and troop transports. The commanders expected resistance but felt confident their numbers and firepower would overwhelm the Krath's relatively small military. They did not account for Sith sorcery on the scale Alima had achieved. She met the Republic fleet personally, commanding a Krath warship that was more temple than military vessel. As the two forces closed to engagement range, she reached out through the dark side and touched the minds of every Republic officer simultaneously. They saw their own ships as enemies, saw friendly vessels as Krath invaders that needed to be destroyed immediately. The fleet turned on itself, captains screaming contradictory orders, while their subordinates obeyed protocols that made sense only within the hallucinations Alima had imposed on their perception. The battle lasted 3 hours. When it ended, every Republic ship was destroyed or disabled. Krath forces had barely fired a shot. The victory was achieved almost entirely through illusion, and it sent a message that reverberated across the galaxy. Conventional military power was useless against opponents who could simply make you kill yourself. The Jedi could no longer delay. Master Jeth, one of the Order's most respected members, called for a great convocation. Every available knight was summoned to the planet Deneba, a desert world chosen for its isolation and defensibility. They would gather in force, discuss the Krath threat, and decide on a unified response. 10,000 Jedi answered the call. Masters and knights from across known space, representing every tradition and philosophy the Order encompassed. They assembled at Mount Meru, a sacred site where Jedi had gathered for millennia. The meeting was unprecedented in modern memory, a show of unity meant to demonstrate the Order's strength and resolve. Among those who arrived was Ulic Qel-Droma, a young knight who had recently completed a dangerous mission on Onderon. He came with his brother Kay and their friend Tot Donata, all three students of Master Arca. Ulic had faced dark side cultists on Onderon and believed he understood the threat. He was wrong, but that realization would come later. The convocation began with traditional ceremony. Master Odan Ura, keeper of the Great Jedi Library on Ossus, presided over the opening remarks. He spoke of the Sith, of how they had nearly destroyed the Republic 1,000 years earlier, of how eternal vigilance was required to prevent their return. Then masters from across the galaxy shared intelligence. The scope of the Krath threat became clear. This was not a minor cult but a rapidly expanding empire. Not dabbling amateurs but practitioners trained in genuine Sith techniques. Not a problem that could be ignored or contained, but an existential threat to the Republic itself. Ulic Qel-Droma proposed a radical solution. He would infiltrate the Krath, pose as a fallen Jedi, learn their secrets, and destroy them from within. It was a dangerous plan that had failed catastrophically in the past, when other Jedi had attempted similar deceptions. But Ulic was young, confident, and grief-stricken by the death of his former master. He was certain he could succeed where others had failed. Master Arca spoke against the plan. He warned that the dark side corrupts from within, that even the strongest Jedi could fall if they opened themselves to that influence. Better to face the Krath directly, with the full might of the assembled Order, than to risk losing one of their own to corruption. The debate continued for hours. Some masters supported Ulic's boldness. Others condemned it as reckless. The convocation that was supposed to demonstrate unity instead revealed deep divisions about how the Order should respond to the Krath threat. None of them knew that Krath agents had infiltrated Deneba weeks earlier. The attack began during a recess. Servant droids that had been maintaining the convocation site suddenly turned on the Jedi. They were serving. These were not sophisticated units, just simple machines designed for cleaning and food service. But they had been reprogrammed, their peaceful functions replaced with murder protocols. The droids wielded whatever they could grasp as weapons. Cleaning tools became bludgeons. Kitchen knives became stabbing implements. They attacked with mechanical precision, targeting Jedi who had lowered their guards during what should have been a safe gathering. But the servant droids were merely a distraction, and a relatively harmless one. Jedi Knights destroyed them easily, confused more than threatened by the strange attack. Some assumed it was a malfunction, others suspected sabotage, but could not imagine its true purpose. The real assault came from orbit. A single Krath vessel, a modified Teton corsair that had approached Deneba, disguised as a supply transport, launched its payload. 100 life pods, each containing a single Krath war droid in standby mode, were fired at Mount Meru with ballistic precision. The pods hit the ground like meteors, cratering the assembly area and scattering the gathered Jedi. Hatches blew open and the war droids emerged, activating their combat protocols the moment they detected targets. These were not like any droids the Jedi had faced before. They moved with disturbing speed, hunched low to the ground, their articulated limbs carrying them forward in a predatory lope that seemed impossible for mechanical constructs. Their sensors identified Jedi signatures, and they attacked with single-minded focus, ignoring everything else. The war droids were armed with pulse-wave weapons that disrupted lightsaber defenses. Jedi found their blades unable to deflect the attacks, energy barriers failing against technology specifically designed to counter them. The droids also carried melee weapons, heavy blades forged from materials that could withstand lightsaber contact, allowing them to engage Jedi in close combat where the Force users' advantages were minimized. But most terrifying was their tactical programming. The droids operated as a networked intelligence, sharing targeting data and coordinating attacks with inhuman precision. They would swarm the most dangerous opponents first, overwhelm them through sheer numbers, then move to the next highest threat. It was a strategy designed specifically to kill Force users, and it was devastatingly effective. The Jedi fought back, of course. 10,000 knights were not helpless. Despite being caught off guard, lightsabers ignited across Mount Meru. In a galaxy of colors, the Force was marshaled in defense, droids lifted and crushed, their systems shorted out by Force lightning from Jedi who had mastered that dangerous technique. But in war, surprise and preparation often matter more than raw power. The Krath had planned this attack carefully. They knew where the Jedi would be, knew they would be distracted by debate, knew that even their impressive reflexes could not fully compensate for being completely unprepared. Master Arca Jeth stood at the center of the chaos, using a Force technique he had developed during the Great Droid Revolution, decades earlier. He reached out through the Force and systematically short-circuited the war droids' neural networks, disabling them without physical contact. It was working. Dozens of droids fell motionless as Arca's power swept through them, but he was concentrating so intensely on the technique that he failed to notice the plasma barrage from 3 droids that had flanked his position. The bolts caught him center mass. Master Arca Jeth, one of the Order's wisest and most powerful members, fell to the Deneba sand and did not rise again. Ulic Qel-Droma witnessed his former master's death from across the battlefield. He saw the Jedi who had trained him, who had been like a father to him, cut down by soulless machines built by a cult of wealthy nobles playing at darkness. In that moment, grief transformed into rage, and rage, as every Jedi knows, is the first step toward the dark side. Ulic made his vow over Arca's cooling body. He would infiltrate the Krath as he had proposed. He would learn their secrets. He would destroy them from within. And nothing, not warnings from other masters, not pleas from his brother, not even the memory of Arca's own cautionary words, would dissuade him from this path. The Krath had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. They had killed one of the Order's greatest masters. They had demonstrated that Jedi were vulnerable despite their powers, and most importantly, they had set in motion the corruption of the very Knight who would eventually give them access to power they could not have achieved alone. Frida Nad's ghost laughed with satisfaction as Ulic Qel-Droma swore his vengeful oath. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now all that remained was watching the young Jedi slowly, inevitably, fall into darkness. The massacre at Deneba marked the moment when the Krath threat became personal for the Jedi Order. No longer a distant problem, but an immediate danger that had struck at their heart. The response would be overwhelming, coordinated and ultimately insufficient to prevent the catastrophe that was already unfolding. Because the Krath's greatest weapon was not their war droids or their dark side sorcery. It was their ability to corrupt the very heroes sent to stop them. The journey to Empress Teta began with the best of intentions and ended in tragedy. But between beginning and end lay months of transformation, so gradual that Ulic Qel-Droma never noticed himself changing until it was far too late. He prepared meticulously for the infiltration. spent weeks in the Great Jedi Library on Ossus, studying everything known about the Sith, about psychological manipulation, about how darkness corrupted from within. Master Udbina, the ancient Neti, who served as librarian, provided access to restricted texts that documented previous failed attempts at exactly what Ulick proposed. Every Jedi who has tried this believed themselves strong enough, Udbina warned, his bark-like features creasing with concern. Every one of them fell. The dark side does not announce itself with trumpets and declarations. It whispers, it suggests, it makes corruption feel like clarity. Ulick listened to the warnings with the particular deafness of the young and certain. He had faced dark side practitioners on Onderon. He had witnessed their techniques and remained uncorrupted. He possessed something the failed Jedi of the past lacked. Not arrogance, he told himself, but realistic assessment of his own capabilities. Nomi Sunrider begged him not to go. She was more than a fellow Jedi to Ulick. They had fought together, trusted each other with their lives, and begun to feel something deeper that neither had yet named. She could sense through their connection that this mission would end badly, though she could not articulate exactly how. "So I feel it too," Ulick admitted, during their final conversation before his departure. "A shadow waiting for me in the Teta system. But Master Arca died because I hesitated, because I argued for infiltration but did not act quickly enough. If I had gone immediately after the convocation began, perhaps he would still be alive." It was guilt driving him, not strategy. Nomi recognized this, but also knew that Ulick's guilt made him immovable. He needed to do this, needed to feel he was honoring his master's memory through action rather than accepting that some tragedies cannot be prevented or avenged. His brother Kay was more direct in his opposition. The two had been close since childhood, trained together under Arca, fought side by side in a dozen conflicts. Kay knew his brother better than anyone and could see the dangerous emotional state driving this decision. "You are not thinking clearly," Kay said bluntly. "Grief has compromised your judgment. Wait, mourn properly. Then if you still believe this is necessary, go with the Order's full support rather than as a lone agent." But waiting felt like betrayal. Every day Ulick delayed was another day the Krath grew stronger, another system conquered, another population enslaved. The urgency was real, but it was also convenient justification for a decision already made. He departed for Empress Teta alone, in a small ship that bore no Jedi markings. His lightsaber remained hidden. His connection to the Order was severed, at least officially. He was now simply another disillusioned Force user, angry at the Jedi for their failures, seeking power that the Order's restrictive codes denied him. It was not entirely an act. He carried genuine anger about how the Krath had been allowed to grow unchecked. He harbored real frustration with the Council's slow deliberations while people died. These authentic emotions would make his cover convincing because they required no pretense. The Empress Teta system appeared in his viewport transformed from the paradise he had read about in historical texts. The orbital approaches bristled with military installations. Patrol ships challenged him before he reached the outer planets. The casual openness that had characterized Tetan culture was gone, replaced by paranoid security that assumed everyone was either loyal or an enemy. Ulick allowed himself to be detained, claimed to be a former Jedi seeking alternatives to the Order's weaknesses, said he had heard the Krath offered power without the restrictive codes that limited what Force users could achieve. The guards were suspicious but intrigued. They had standing orders to report any Force users attempting to enter the system. He was brought to Sinagar in restraints, not because they believed he was dangerous, but because protocol demanded it. The capital had changed dramatically. Since the Keto cousins' coup, the crystal towers remained, but their beauty was diminished by Krath banners and the looming presence of the Iron Citadel, now festooned with dark side symbols that hurt the eye to perceive directly. Public executions were scheduled for that afternoon in the main plaza. Ulic's captors decided he should witness what happened to enemies of the Krath before being granted audience with the rulers. It was meant to be intimidating, to demonstrate the cost of opposition. Instead, it provided Ulic with his opportunity. The condemned were ordinary citizens accused of harboring loyalty to the old government. Their crimes were trivial by any reasonable standard, refusing to attend Krath ceremonies, hiding family heirlooms that the state had declared forfeit, teaching children that the previous rulers had not been monsters. In a totalitarian system, memory itself becomes rebellion. Satel and Alima presided over the executions personally. They sat on thrones that had been moved from the Iron Citadel to the plaza, elevated above the crowd so all could see their ruler's judgment. Both wore ceremonial robes that incorporated Sith designs with Teton noble aesthetics. Both radiated dark side energy that made Ulic's skin crawl with recognition. The execution method that day was carbonite freezing. Each prisoner was led to a platform, forced to kneel before a vat of the molten mineral. Alima would speak words in Sith, performing a ritual that served no purpose except to extend the psychological torture. Then the prisoner would be pushed forward into the carbonite, their scream cutting off as the substance engulfed and hardened. Ulic watched with carefully maintained neutrality. Inside, horror and rage battled for dominance. These were innocent people dying for the entertainment of a crowd that had been trained to enjoy suffering. This was civilization inverted. Everything the Jedi stood for mocked and destroyed. But he could not reveal his true feelings. Not yet, not until he was close enough to the Krath leadership to strike effectively. The executions were interrupted by staged violence. Ulic did not recognize it as staged at first. A group of citizens suddenly produced weapons and attacked the guards surrounding the plaza. Chaos erupted. The crowd panicked and fled. And in the confusion, several attackers fought their way toward the thrones where Satel and Alima sat. One assailant reached Alima, blade raised to strike. She made no move to defend herself, simply watched with an expression of amused anticipation. Because this was theater, the entire scenario was manufactured to test the newly arrived Force user's reflexes and loyalties. Ulic reacted instinctively. He was Jedi trained, conditioned by years of discipline to protect the helpless and prevent murder regardless of whether the victim deserved protection. He reached out through the Force, yanked the attacker away from Alima, and struck him unconscious before the man could recover his balance. Only after the threat was neutralized did Ulic realize what he had done. He had revealed his abilities, demonstrated his power, and most damningly, he had saved the life of one of the galaxy's worst tyrants. Alima smiled. It was not a grateful expression. It was satisfaction at a prediction confirmed. "You must be the fallen Jedi we were told to expect," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested dark side manipulation of sound itself. "How convenient that you arrived just in time to save my life. Some might call it fate." Ulic understood immediately that he had been maneuvered, that everything from his detention to this staged assassination was designed to force him into revealing himself while simultaneously creating a debt. He had saved Alima's life, even though the threat was fictional. She now had grounds to reward him, to bring him into the Krath organization, to begin the slow process of corruption. The trap had been set, and he had walked into it with eyes open. Satel descended from his throne, studying Ulic with the careful attention of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. "You have power, but lack purpose. Training, but no direction. The Jedi taught you to suppress your potential. We can teach you to embrace it." It was almost exactly the pitch Ulic had expected. The Krath's entire philosophy centered on discarding limitation and seizing power. They promised transformation from restricted Jedi into something greater. It was seductive for Force users who chafed under the Order's codes, and Ulick had prepared himself to appear as exactly that type. "The Jedi are weak," Ulick said, injecting his voice with contempt he did not entirely have to fake. "They lecture about balance while the galaxy burns. They preach patience while innocents die. I did not leave the Order to find more limitations." Alima studied him with eyes that saw more than they should. She was naturally gifted in reading people, the talent now enhanced by Sith training. She could sense truth and lies, could feel the complex mixture of genuine anger and calculated performance in Ulick's words. But she also sensed his power, raw and vast, barely contained by Jedi discipline. If she could crack that discipline, if she could corrupt this Jedi and turn his strength to the Krath's purposes, the strategic value would be immense. "Power without limitation," she said softly, moving closer to Ulick. "Purpose without restriction, strength without apology. This is what we offer. Not everyone is capable of accepting such gifts. The weak cling to their chains and call it morality. But you are not weak, are you?" It was manipulation so blatant that Ulick almost laughed, but he also recognized that Alima was not trying to be subtle. She was testing whether he would accept obvious manipulation, whether his hunger for infiltration would make him complicit in his own corruption. "I am strong enough for whatever you teach," Ulick replied. And with those words, the first step was taken down a path that would lead to fratricide and galactic war. Satel and Alima inducted him into the Krath that very day. There was a ceremony conducted in the Iron Citadel before an audience of masked nobles who had long ago stopped being individuals and become extensions of the cult's collective will. Ulick knelt before the thrones. He spoke oaths he did not mean, swearing loyalty to principles he despised. But oaths have power even when spoken insincerely. Words shape reality, particularly when uttered in places saturated with dark side energy. The Iron Citadel had been transformed into a nexus of corruption, where the barrier between thought and consequence was dangerously thin. As Ulick spoke his false vows, he felt something shift inside himself, a door opening that he had intended to keep closed. A whisper that sounded almost like Frieden Nad's voice, though he had no way of knowing that. He was given quarters in the Citadel, assigned servants who were actually watchers, provided with texts on Sith philosophy that he was expected to study, and granted access to Alima herself, who had decided to take personal responsibility for his education. She was beautiful. Ulick could not deny that, but it was a beauty that felt calculated, weaponized, designed to seduce and distract. She dressed in ways that drew attention, moved with studied grace, spoke in tones that bypassed rational thought and appealed directly to baser instincts. Ulick recognized the manipulation and believed himself immune to it. He was Jedi-trained, disciplined in resisting such obvious tactics, but immunity and resistance are not the same thing. A poison you recognize is still a poison, still entering your system, still beginning its work. Days became weeks. Alima taught him Sith techniques, starting with simple enhancements of physical ability and progressing to more complex manipulations of perception. Ulick learned because that was his mission: gather intelligence on Krath capabilities, document their techniques, understand their weaknesses so the Jedi could exploit them. But learning dark side abilities requires opening yourself to the dark side. Even academic study of Sith philosophy can plant seeds that later germinate. Ulick was smart enough to recognize the danger, but arrogant enough to believe he could control it. Meanwhile, his friends became concerned. Nomi Sunrider reached out through the Force, trying to sense his condition. What she felt terrified her. Ulick's presence had changed, taking on tones she associated with darkness. She organized a rescue mission, convincing Kai and Tot Donetta to help extract Ulick before it was too late. But Satel had anticipated this response. He knew that Jedi rarely operated alone, that Ulick's friends would eventually come for him. Surveillance had identified Nomi when she arrived in the Theta system, attempting to maintain a low profile while searching for her fellow knight. She was captured and imprisoned in the Iron Citadel's dungeons. Satel planned to use her as leverage, forcing Ulick to prove his loyalty by choosing between his mission and his former comrade. But that plan was superseded by a more immediate concern. Satel's paranoia had grown since inducting Ulick into the Krath. He saw potential threats everywhere, particularly in this powerful Force user who had appeared conveniently and risen quickly in Alima's favor. His cousin was spending increasing amounts of time with the former Jedi. They trained together, dined together, had long conversations about Sith philosophy that Satel was not invited to join. Alima's interest in Ulick appeared to extend beyond mere instruction. Jealousy joined paranoia in Satel's increasingly unstable mind. He began to suspect that Ulick was exactly what he claimed to be on arrival, a Jedi spy, maintaining his cover, seducing Alima as part of his infiltration strategy. And so Satel made a decision that would ultimately cost him everything. He ordered Ulick seized and interrogated, not through conversation or force technique, but through torture designed to break will and extract truth. Ulick was taken from his quarters by guards who offered no explanation, brought to dungeons he had not known existed beneath the already extensive cellars of the Iron Citadel, chained to a wall in a chamber whose stones were stained with evidence of previous occupants' suffering. Satel arrived with instruments both technological and alchemical, devices designed to inflict pain, substances crafted through Sith techniques to do more than harm the body. "Tell me who sent you," Satel demanded. "Confess your true purpose and your death will be quick." Ulick said nothing, not because he was resisting strategically, but because he genuinely did not know what answer would keep him alive. Admit to being Jedi and prove Satel's suspicions correct. Maintain his cover and be tortured until Satel was satisfied of his loyalty or death ended the interrogation. The torture began. Physical pain first, which Ulick endured through Jedi techniques that allowed him to distance consciousness from sensation. But Satel had learned much during his studies. He knew how to circumvent such defenses. The Sith poison was injected directly into Ulick's bloodstream, an alchemical compound that Satel had perfected through experimentation on hundreds of test subjects. It targeted the connection between body and force, inflaming it, turning what should be a source of strength into a vector for agony. Ulick screamed. He could not help it. The poison lit his nerves on fire, made every heartbeat an explosion of suffering, turned his own power against him. And worse, it began to transform his emotional state. Fear became rage, pain became hatred. The Jedi calm he had maintained throughout the infiltration shattered under chemical assault. He lashed out through the Force, destroyed the chains holding him, wrecked the torture devices, reached for Satel with murderous intent, and stopped himself. Barely, at the last possible moment, retained enough control to not kill his torturer. Satel smiled, despite the danger. The poison works exactly as designed. Your anger fuels your power. Your hatred makes you strong. You have just taken your first real step away from Jedi weakness. Alima arrived before the situation could deteriorate further. She had been alerted by servants loyal to her rather than her cousin. She found Ulick collapsed on the dungeon floor, Satel standing over him with expression torn between satisfaction and fear. "He is mine," Alima said coldly. "You do not touch what belongs to me without permission." The confrontation between the cousins was brief but revealing. Satel backed down, not from fear of Alima's power, but from recognition that he had overstepped. The Krath was jointly ruled, decisions affecting key personnel required consensus. Alima tended to Ulic personally, brought him to her private chambers, used Sith healing techniques to stabilize his body while the poison continued its work on his mind. She held him through the delirium, whispered reassurances, promised protection from Satal's paranoia. And Ulic, lost in suffering and chemical rage, found himself clinging to his tormentor for comfort, found himself grateful to the woman who was part of the system that had brutalized him, found himself impossibly beginning to trust her. The poison did not fade quickly. It had been designed for prolonged effect to continue inflaming emotions long after the physical symptoms subsided. Ulic spent weeks recovering, and during that time Alima never left his side for long. She was patient, kind, even in her own twisted way. She explained that Satal was threatened by Ulic's power, that jealousy drove the interrogation, that she would ensure it never happened again. She positioned herself as Ulic's protector within the Krath, the one person he could trust. It was masterful manipulation, creating the threat and the rescue, torture and comfort from the same source, breaking someone down and building them back differently. Ulic knew he was being manipulated. His Jedi training had not evaporated, but knowing and resisting are not the same. The poison had compromised his emotional controls. Isolation had weakened his connection to who he had been before infiltration, and Alima was offering something he had not realized he craved. Purpose. Not the abstract purpose of serving the Order or protecting the Republic, but concrete, immediate purpose as a valued member of a community that recognized his strength. Months passed. Bullock's friends attempted another rescue, breaking into the Iron Citadel with desperate courage. They found him, confronted him, begged him to leave with them. And Ulic refused. Not because he was fully corrupted, not because he had abandoned the Jedi entirely, but because he truly believed that he was still in control, that he was maintaining his cover, that he could complete the mission from inside the Krath rather than retreating to safety. Nomi Sunrider stared at him with tears streaming down her face. Kay looked at his brother like he was a stranger. Tot Donator simply shook his head in sorrow. "I am handling this," Ulic told them. "Trust me, I know what I am doing." They left without him because he gave them no choice. Returned to Ossus with the terrible news that Uelek Keldroma had fallen, just as every master had warned he would. But Ulic convinced himself they were wrong. He was not fallen, he was embedded. The distinction seemed important. Alima made him warlord of the Krath military forces, gave him command of the armies, the fleets, the war droids, trusted him with real power, and that trust felt like validation. He was still Jedi, he told himself, still maintaining cover, still gathering intelligence. The lie was almost convincing. Certainly Ulic believed it, right up until the moment Satal confronted him again, forcing a choice that would reveal exactly how far he had fallen without realizing it. The confrontation came without warning in the throne room of the Iron Citadel, where the carbonite frozen corpses of Lord Keto and Lady Magda still hung as silent witnesses to their children's corruption. Satal had been planning this moment for weeks, gathering evidence he believed proved Ulic's continued loyalty to the Jedi Order. Ulic had grown comfortable in his role as Krath's warlord. He commanded respect from soldiers who had initially viewed him with suspicion. He had reorganized the military into a more effective force, improving logistics and tactical doctrine. He told himself this was part of his infiltration, learning their capabilities from within. He did not acknowledge that he was genuinely proud of the improvements he had implemented. Alima stood beside him now more often than not. They had become partners in ways that went beyond strategic alliance. She had seduced him gradually, so slowly that he never noticed the progression from captor to confidant to something more intimate. He still believed he maintained emotional distance, still thought he was using her for information rather than being used himself. The truth was more complex. Alima had genuine feelings for Ulic, or as close to genuine as someone corrupted by the dark side could experience. She saw in him potential that even Satel lacked, raw power combined with Jedi discipline. If she could fully convert him, make him truly hers, rather than a pretender maintaining cover, the Krath would possess a weapon that could challenge even Exar Kun. But Satel saw only threat. He had compiled what he considered proof of Ulic's deception, communications the former Jedi thought were secure, moments when his mask slipped, and Jedi conditioning showed through, the way he hesitated before certain acts of cruelty that true Krath would embrace without thought. "You remain Jedi," Satel declared before the assembled court. "You pretend loyalty while gathering intelligence to use against us. Your every action is calculated toward eventual betrayal." Ulic felt genuine surprise at the accusation, not because it was wrong, but because he had begun to doubt its truth himself. Was he still Jedi? He no longer meditated on the light side, no longer felt the connection to the Order that had once sustained him. The mission he claimed to be pursuing had become abstract, something he mentioned to himself when guilt surfaced, but no longer actively worked toward. "I have commanded your armies," Ulic replied, keeping his voice steady. "Led your forces to victory, expanded Krath territory through my strategies. What spy would serve his enemies so effectively?" "A patient one," Satel countered, "waiting for the perfect moment to strike, building trust that can be betrayed for maximum impact." Alima watched the exchange with calculating intensity. This was the crisis she had anticipated and prepared for. Satal's paranoia had finally focused on the correct target for the wrong reasons. Ulic was indeed still technically Jedi in his core identity, but he had been compromised far beyond what Satal suspected. He was no longer capable of effective betrayal because he no longer knew what side he truly served. The moment demanded she choose between her cousin and her lover, between the partnership that had built the Krath and the relationship that promised to elevate it. For Alima, it was not a difficult choice. "Satel questions your loyalty," she said to Ulic, her voice carrying across the throne room. "Prove him wrong. Show us that you have truly embraced what we offer, that you are Krath in truth, not performance." Ulic understood immediately what she was demanding, a demonstration of commitment that would burn bridges, an action so contrary to Jedi philosophy that it would prove his conversion beyond doubt. He had a choice. He could refuse, admit the infiltration, fight his way out of the Iron Citadel and flee back to the Order, accept that the mission had failed, that Satel was correct about his divided loyalties, that he needed to escape before corruption became complete. Or he could prove his loyalty through action that would make return to the Jedi impossible. The Sith poison that Satal had injected weeks earlier still worked in Ulic's system. It had never fully metabolized, continuing its slow transformation of his emotional centers. Anger came more quickly now. Hatred felt more natural. The dark side whispered constantly, promising strength, offering justifications. And Freedon Nad's ghost stood invisible behind the thrones, watching his carefully laid plans approach fruition. Ulic stepped forward, not in retreat but in challenge. He called his lightsaber to his hand through the Force, the weapon igniting with a snap hiss that echoed through the suddenly silent chamber. "You question my commitment," he said to Satel, his voice carrying tones that had nothing to do with Jedi calm. "You accuse me of deception while hiding your own weakness behind paranoia. If there is a spy in the Krath leadership, it is the one too afraid to trust his own power." Satel's face flushed with rage. He had expected denial or confession, not counter-accusation. He drew his own weapon, a curved blade enhanced through Sith alchemy to withstand lightsaber contact. "Then prove your truth through combat," Satel snarled. "If you are truly Krath, you will have the strength to strike me down. If you remain Jedi, your weakness will be exposed before this court." Alima made no move to intervene. This was the test she had orchestrated, forcing both men to commit to a confrontation that would resolve the leadership tension that had plagued the Krath since Ulick's arrival. The duel began with neither combatant holding back. Satel fought with the desperate intensity of someone who knew he was outmatched, relying on alchemical enhancements and Sith sorcery to compensate for inferior technique. He summoned illusions to confuse Ulick's perception, threw poisons that would have melted unprotected flesh, drew on every dirty trick he had learned during years of dark side study. Ulick fought with Jedi precision corrupted by rage. His blade work was flawless, muscle memory from thousands of hours of training. But the emotions driving those techniques were not discipline and duty. They were anger at Satel's accusations, hatred for being questioned, a burning need to prove himself to Alima and the assembled Krath. He was fighting not as Jedi but as Sith, and he did not notice the transformation. The poison in his system responded to combat stress, flooding his bloodstream with chemicals that amplified aggression. Each clash of weapons, each near miss, each moment of danger pushed him further from the light. The dark side fed on his emotions, growing stronger as he grew angrier. Satel realized too late that he had provoked a confrontation he could not win. Ulick was simply too skilled, too powerful, too far beyond whatever level Satel had achieved through study and artifact manipulation. The duel had one inevitable conclusion. Ulick's blade found its mark, pierced through Satel's defenses and struck center mass with killing precision. The co-founder of the Krath, heir to House Keto, student of Freeden Nad himself, fell to the throne room floor as his life bled away. In that moment, Ulick Keldroma's fall to the dark side became complete, not because he had killed in combat. Jedi did that when necessary, not because he had defended himself against someone trying to murder him. That was justified under any interpretation of the code. But because of what he felt as Satel died: satisfaction, triumph, pride in his superior skill. He had proven himself before the Krath court, demonstrated his power, earned Alima's approval, and he felt no guilt, no horror, no recognition that he had just committed murder over a question of loyalty to an organization he was supposed to be infiltrating. Freeden Nad's ghost smiled. The trap was complete. Ulick believed himself still Jedi while acting purely as Sith. The self-deception was perfect because it was genuine. He would rationalize this killing as necessary for maintaining cover, would find justifications for every subsequent atrocity, would slowly, inevitably, become exactly what he pretended to be. Alima descended from her throne and walked to where Ulick stood over Satel's corpse. She placed her hand on his cheek with something approaching tenderness. "You are mine now," she said softly, "truly and completely mine. No more doubts, no more questions. You have proven yourself in the only way that matters." Ulick looked into her eyes and saw reflected there not the Jedi Knight he had been, but the Sith warlord he had become. And he did not turn away from that reflection, did not reject the transformation, did not feel the horror that recognition should have sparked. Instead, he pulled Alima close and kissed her, claimed her as she had claimed him, accepted the role he had been pretending to play until pretense and reality merged into something new and terrible. The court erupted in approval. The Krath had new leadership. Satel's death removed the paranoid, unstable element that had threatened internal cohesion. Ulick's victory proved strength that the cult respected above all else. And Alima stood as sole heir to House Keto, ruling now with a warlord whose power exceeded anything Satel could have offered. The consequences rippled outward immediately. Krath forces across occupied territories received updated orders. Military expansion accelerated. Conquered populations faced intensified oppression as the new leadership demonstrated its strength. And in the Jedi Temple on Ossus, Masters felt a disturbance in the Force, the sensation of a light extinguishing, a presence they had known all their lives transforming into something dark and foreign. Nomi Sunrider wept openly, knowing without needing confirmation that Ulic was lost, that the man she loved no longer existed, that a Sith warlord now wore his face and wielded his power. Kaldroma refused to accept that his brother had fallen beyond redemption. He began planning another rescue mission, this one not to extract Ulic from the Krath, but to save him from himself. It was a mission that would end in tragedy, but that outcome lay months in the future. For now, the Krath celebrated. Their new leadership promised expansion beyond anything previously attempted. Alima's strategic cunning combined with Ulic's military genius created a partnership that seemed unstoppable. But there were powers in the galaxy greater than the Krath, forces that had been watching their rise with calculating interest, and on the Sith world of Yavin 4, in temples that predated the Republic itself, another fallen Jedi sensed a disturbance. Exar Kun had heard of the Krath, had studied reports of their techniques and territorial gains, had dismissed them as amateurs playing with powers they did not understand. But now sensing Ulic's transformation, feeling the raw strength of this newly fallen Jedi, Kun reconsidered his assessment. Perhaps these Krath were not rivals to be destroyed, but tools to be utilized. Perhaps this Ulic-killed Droma could serve purposes beyond leading armies for aristocratic cultists. Exar Kun began preparations for a journey to the Empress Teta system. He would meet this fallen Jedi, assess his power, and if the warlord proved worthy, Kun would offer him something Alima never could. True Sith mastery, training from one who had walked the temples of Korriban, knowledge passed down from Dark Lords who had ruled galaxies. But first, there would be a test. Khorne did not accept inferiors. He would challenge Ulic, demonstrate superior power, and only then extend the offer of apprenticeship. He did not anticipate that the meeting would produce not master and servant but equals. That ancient Sith spirits would recognize both fallen Jedi as worthy vessels for restored darkness. The stage was set for the Great Sith War. All the pieces were moving into position. Graith forces poised for massive expansion, a fallen Jedi commanding armies, a Dark Lord seeking apprentices, and across the galaxy, the Jedi Order preparing for conflict they knew was inevitable, but whose scale they could not imagine. The tragedy of Ulic Qel-Droma's fall was that he never recognized it. He remained convinced of his own control, his own agency, his own ability to return to the light when the mission concluded. He told himself Sattel's death was justified, that his relationship with Alima was tactical, that he maintained emotional distance from the atrocities committed in his name. The lies we tell ourselves are always the most convincing, and Ulic had become a master of self-deception, matching any manipulation Alima had practiced on him. He stood in the throne room that night, after the celebration ended and the court dispersed, looked up at the carbonite corpses of Lord Keto and Lady Magda, wondered briefly what Settel's frozen body would look like beside his parents, and felt nothing. No guilt, no horror, just cold satisfaction that obstacles had been removed. That absence of feeling was more terrifying than any emotion could have been. But Ulic did not recognize the void where his compassion had lived, did not understand that the mission he claimed to pursue had been abandoned long ago. He was Krath now, truly and completely. The infiltrator had become the infiltrated. The hunter had become the hunted, and the darkness that had entered through careful cracks had flooded every chamber of his soul. Frieden Nad watched his vessel walk away toward Alima's chambers. The ghost had chosen well. This fallen Jedi would accomplish what Nad himself could not, would spread corruption across the galaxy, would break the Jedi Order that had destroyed him centuries ago. Revenge was patient, and after 400 years, Frida Nad could afford to be very patient indeed. Exar Kun arrived in the Empress Teta system 3 weeks after Satel's death. His ship, the Starstorm I, emerged from hyperspace, flanked by Massassi fighters that moved with inhuman precision. The Krath patrols that challenged his approach were brushed aside, not through violence, but through overwhelming force presence that made their instruments malfunction and their pilots doubt their own perceptions. Alima felt his arrival before sensors detected his ship. The dark side rippled with power that dwarfed even her considerable abilities. She reached out through the Force, trying to assess this newcomer's intentions, and encountered a mind so thoroughly immersed in darkness that touching it felt like drowning. "We have a visitor," she told Ulick, who was reviewing invasion plans in the war room. "Someone powerful, someone dangerous." Ulick extended his own senses and immediately understood her concern. The presence approaching Sinagar radiated strength that exceeded anything he had encountered. Not raw power like an untrained force sensitive, but disciplined mastery that spoke of years of study and practice. This was not an amateur dark side dabbler. This was a true Sith practitioner. Exar Kun landed his ship in the Iron Citadel's private hangar without requesting permission. The audacity of it should have prompted a military response, but the guards who approached to challenge him found themselves paralyzed by fear they could not rationalize. They stood frozen, weapons unfired, as Kun descended the boarding ramp flanked by Massassi warriors whose muscles had been enhanced through Sith alchemy into something no longer quite organic. He walked through the citadel like he owned it. Servants fled before him. Krath officials who tried to demand identification found themselves forgetting why they had approached. Quan moved through layers of security as if they did not exist, following the dark side's pull toward the throne room, where Alima and Ulick waited. The throne room doors opened, though no one touched them. Exar Kun entered, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees as his presence disrupted the environmental systems. He wore robes that combined Jedi aesthetics with Sith designs, decorated with symbols that hurt to perceive directly. His lightsaber hung at his side, but his real weapon was the overwhelming confidence that radiated from him like heat from a star. "You call yourself Sith," Kun said, without preamble. "You play at darkness while understanding nothing of its true depths. You have built an empire of amateurs, impressive in scale but pathetic in execution." Alima bristled at the insult. She had expected respect from this visitor, recognition of the Christ's achievements. Instead, she received contempt from someone who acted as if her entire organization was beneath his notice. "Who are you to judge what we have accomplished?" she demanded, drawing on the Force to project authority. Kun laughed. It was not a kind sound. "I am what you pretend to be, trained in Sith temples that predate your civilization, educated by ghosts of Dark Lords whose power makes your Frida Nad seem like a child. I have walked Korriban and survived. I have conquered Yavin 4 and bent the Massassi to my will. I am Dark Lord of the Sith, not through inheritance but through achievement." Ulick stepped forward, placing himself between Kun and Alima. The gesture was protective, demonstrating whose side he had chosen. "You enter our stronghold uninvited, insult our accomplishments, threaten our authority. Give me one reason not to have you killed where you stand." The Kun's expression shifted from contempt to interest. He studied Ulick with the attention of someone recognizing potential value. "You are the fallen Jedi, the one who murdered his way into leadership. I sense power in you, wasted though it is on this organization of aristocrats playing at warfare." "I am Krath, warlord," Ulick replied, his hand moving to his lightsaber. "And you have just made a fatal error in coming here." The challenge was issued. Exar Kun smiled, accepting it. His own weapon ignited, revealing a blade configuration none of them had seen before. A double-bladed lightsaber, crimson energy, extending from both ends of a curved hilt. It spun with impossible speed as Kun activated it, creating a wheel of deadly light. Ulic attacked without further warning. His Jedi training took over, body moving through combat forms perfected over decades. But he fought now with dark side enhancement, drawing on rage and hatred to amplify his speed and strength. Kun met the assault with contemptuous ease. His double blade blocked strikes from multiple angles simultaneously. His footwork was flawless, maintaining perfect defensive position while counterattacking with precision that forced Ulic into increasingly desperate maneuvers. They fought across the throne room, destroying furniture and scarring the walls with missed strikes. Alima watched with growing concern. She had believed Ulic invincible after witnessing his duel with Satel. Seeing him matched, even overpowered, by this intruder shook her confidence in everything the Krath had built. The duel was not close. Kun toyed with Ulic, demonstrating superior technique while expending minimal effort. He could have killed the Krath warlord a dozen times but chose not to, prolonging the combat to make his point. That despite Ulic's power, despite his training, despite his fall to darkness, he remained inferior to someone with true Sith mastery. Ulic recognized this, and it infuriated him. He poured more strength into his attacks, drew deeper on the dark side, allowed rage to consume any remaining tactical thinking. He fought like a berserker, all offense and no defense, determined to land at least one solid hit, even if it cost him his life. And then something extraordinary happened. The Sith amulets both combatants wore, gifts from Freeden Nad, separated by months but identical in origin, suddenly activated. They glowed with crimson energy that spread across their bearer's skin like living circuits. The Force surged through the throne room with intensity that shattered windows and extinguished lights. Both Jedi froze mid-strike. Their lightsabers hung motionless in attack positions. Their bodies would not respond to conscious commands. An external force had seized control, paralyzing them completely. A figure materialized between the combatants, translucent but unmistakably present, dressed in ancient armor that predated the Republic by millennia. The ghost of Marka Ragnus, former Dark Lord of the Sith, had been summoned by the amulet's resonance. "Enough," the ghost commanded, and his voice carried authority that transcended death. "You waste your strength fighting each other when enemies surround you. The Jedi gather their forces, the Republic prepares its fleets, and you squabble over dominance like territorial beasts." Ragnar studied both frozen warriors with an expression that mixed satisfaction and disappointment. "You are both worthy vessels for the Sith's return, both powerful enough to challenge the Order, both corrupted sufficiently to serve darkness without hesitation, but separately, you will fail. Together, properly organized, you might succeed." The ghost turned to Exar Kun. "You have studied in my temples, learned from my teachings, embraced the dark side with dedication that honors the Sith tradition. You shall be Dark Lord of the Sith, master of this new order we shall build." Then Ragnus faced Ulic. "You have conquered through strength, led armies to victory, demonstrated power that commands respect. You shall be apprentice to the Dark Lord, second in command of the brotherhood we shall forge." Neither of them could speak, paralyzed as they were. But both felt the weight of Ragnus's judgment, felt the ancient power that infused his decree with binding force. This was not suggestion but command, enforced through Sith sorcery that had been prepared specifically for this moment. The ghost raised his hands, and energy flowed from him into both warriors. Knowledge transferred directly into their minds. Hierarchies established through force bonds they could not break. destinies shaped through manipulation that made free will irrelevant. "You will form the Brotherhood of the Sith," Ragnas declared. "You will unite the Krath armies with Massassi warriors. You will convert fallen Jedi and recruit dark side practitioners. You will wage war on the Order and the Republic simultaneously. And through this conflict, you will achieve what I could not in life: the permanent destruction of the Jedi and the triumph of the Sith philosophy." The paralysis released. Both Ulick and Kuhn staggered, suddenly supporting their own weight again. The ghost began to fade, his purpose accomplished. But before he vanished completely, Ragnas delivered one final instruction. "Do not fail me. I have waited 1,000 years for this opportunity, for vessels strong enough to carry the Sith banner into war against our ancient enemies. Disappoint me, and death will seem merciful compared to what I shall inflict upon your spirits." Then he was gone, leaving behind two former enemies who now found themselves bound together by forces neither completely understood. Exar Kun deactivated his lightsaber. The contempt had left his expression, replaced by calculating assessment. "It seems we are partners now, not by choice, but by decree of powers greater than ourselves." Ulick said nothing for a long moment, processing what had just occurred. He had come to the throne room prepared to defend Alima and the Krath. He left it as second in command to someone he had just been trying to kill. The transition was jarring, but the force bonds Ragnas had established made rebellion feel impossible. "If we are to wage war on the scale Ragnas demands," Ulick finally said, "we will need more than Krath forces and your Massassi. We need allies across the galaxy. Forces that can match Republic fleets in open combat." Kuhn nodded. "The Mandalorians. I have heard they seek worthy opponents, that their culture revolves around finding strength to test themselves against. Then we give them war," Ulick replied. "The greatest conflict since the Hyperspace War, battles across thousands of systems, challenges worthy of their greatest warriors." Alena had been silent during this entire exchange. Watching her carefully constructed power base dissolve, she had ruled the Krath, controlled Ulick through seduction and manipulation, commanded an expanding empire. Now she found herself reduced to third in a hierarchy established by dead Sith lords. But she was smart enough not to protest. Not yet. Not while the Force bonds were fresh and Ragnas's power still lingered. She would accept her diminished role, wait for opportunities, and plan how to reclaim what had been taken from her. "The Krath stands ready to join this brotherhood," she said, with practiced diplomacy. "Our resources, our armies, our territories are at your disposal, Dark Lord Khorne." The title tasted like ash in her mouth, but she spoke it with apparent sincerity. Khorne studied her with eyes that saw more than they should. "You resent this arrangement. You hunger for the power that has been taken. This is natural. But understand that your resentment changes nothing. Fight the bonds Ragnas established, and you will destroy yourself. Accept your role, serve faithfully, and you will share in the Brotherhood's triumph." It was threat and promise combined. Alima bowed her head in acknowledgement, concealing the rage that burned behind her eyes. The meeting concluded with strategic planning. Hunen would return to Yavin 4 and gather his forces. Ulick would command the Krath military and begin recruiting Mandalorians. Alima would govern the occupied territories and continue expanding through the deep core. They would reconvene in 3 months, by which time each leader should have prepared their forces for the war to come. The Great Sith War. A conflict that would consume the galaxy and decide whether the Jedi Order survived or the Sith reclaimed their ancient dominance. As Exar Kun departed, Ulick stood in the throne room that had become familiar over months of corruption. He thought about the mission that had brought him to Empress Teta: infiltrate the Krath, learn their secrets, destroy them from within. That Jedi Knight no longer existed, The man who had made that vow was dead, replaced by someone who now commanded the very forces he had once opposed. The infiltrator had become the warlord, the pretender had become genuine, and Ulick could not identify the exact moment when performance became reality. He told himself he maintained control, that he could still turn against the Brotherhood when necessary, that some part of him remained Jedi. But the lies were growing thinner. Soon they would evaporate entirely, leaving only truth that Ulick Qel-Drama had fallen completely, irrevocably, without ever acknowledging the transformation until it was far too late. The galaxy would burn because of his choices. Millions would die in the war he would help orchestrate. And when the final accounting came, when the consequences of his corruption became impossible to ignore, he would discover that some falls cannot be survived. The Brotherhood of the Sith appeared unstoppable during those first months of the Great Sith War. Exar Kun's Massassi warriors combined with the Krath's technological superiority created a military force unlike anything the Republic had encountered in a millennium. And when Mandalore the Indomitable joined the Alliance, bringing with him the galaxy's most fearsome warrior culture, the strategic balance shifted dramatically. Ulick had secured the Mandalorian alliance through single combat, a duel that became legend among both cultures. Mandalore respected only strength demonstrated personally, not inherited through bloodlines or granted through political maneuvering. When Ulick challenged him aboard his flagship and fought to a standstill despite the Mandalorian's superior experience, respect was earned through blade and blood. The Mandalorians brought discipline that the Krath lacked and numbers that Kun's Massassi could not match. Their fleets were maintained with religious devotion. Their warriors trained from childhood in every form of combat. Most importantly, they followed orders with absolute precision, not from fear or indoctrination, but from cultural conditioning that made hierarchy sacred. Within 6 months of the Brotherhood's formation, a dozen Republic worlds had fallen. Within a year, entire sectors were under Sith control. The Senate debated endlessly about appropriate responses while their territories burned. The Jedi Council coordinated defense efforts, but even their combined wisdom struggled against an enemy that seemed to anticipate every countermove. Ulick proved himself a brilliant military strategist. His Jedi training provided understanding of Republic tactics, while his immersion in darkness freed him from the ethical constraints that limited conventional warfare. He bombed civilian targets to break morale, took hostages to prevent resistance, deployed chemical weapons in situations where conventional assaults would cost too many Sith lives. Each atrocity came easier than the last. Each compromise of the principles he once held sacred felt more justified by military necessity. Ulick had become exactly what he fought against, but self-awareness is the first casualty of corruption. Alima commanded the Krath forces with increasing resentment. She had been sole ruler of an expanding empire before Kanan's arrival. Now she took orders, subordinated to men whose power derived from force sensitivity rather than political acumen. Her illusion techniques remained valuable for psychological warfare, but strategic decisions were made above her rank. She hid her anger behind masks of compliance, smiled at war councils while plotting ways to reclaim authority, slept beside Ulick each night, and whispered poison during moments of intimacy, suggestions that perhaps Kun was the real obstacle to their combined greatness. Ulick dismissed these hints initially. He was bound to Kun through force connections established by Marka Ragnos, obligations that made betrayal feel physically impossible. But Alima was patient and skilled at manipulation. She planted seeds that would germinate slowly, growing roots into doubts Ulick barely acknowledged. The first major crack appeared during the planning for the assault on Coruscant itself. Kun proposed a direct attack on the Republic capital, arguing that capturing the seat of government would shatter enemy morale and force surrender. Ulick countered that such an assault was premature, that their forces needed more time to consolidate conquered territories before attempting something so ambitious. The disagreement was tactical, not personal, but Alima saw opportunity in the division. She sided with Khorne publicly, positioning herself as the Dark Lord's supporter against Ulick's caution. It was calculated to drive a wedge between the Brotherhood's leaders, to create resentment where partnership had existed. Khorne noticed her maneuvering and recognized it for what it was. He had dealt with ambitious subordinates before, crushed those who overstepped, and cultivated those who served useful purposes. Alima fell into an ambiguous category. Her abilities made her valuable, but her hunger for power made her dangerous. "Your lover seeks to divide us," Khorne told Ulick during a private conversation after the War Council. "She plays us against each other, hoping to benefit from the conflict." Ulick wanted to deny this, but could not. He had seen the same patterns, felt Alima's manipulation even as he fell for it. The realization brought not anger, but exhaustion. Every relationship in his life had become transaction. Every intimacy was strategy. Even love, if what he felt for Alima could be called that, served purposes beyond affection. "What would you have me do?" Ulick asked. "She commands the Krath. We need their forces." "We need their armies," Khorne corrected. "We do not need her specifically. There are other Krath officials who could assume command, ones less ambitious, more compliant." It was suggestion of murder delivered with casual indifference. Khorne had killed so many that individual deaths no longer registered as significant. Alima was just another obstacle that could be removed if she became more liability than asset. Ulick found himself unable to agree to killing her, but also unable to defend her beyond military utility. What did that say about their relationship, about what he had become? He set the questions aside, as he set aside all uncomfortable self-reflection and focused on immediate tactical concerns. The assault on Coruscant proceeded despite Ulick's reservations. Alima commanded a significant portion of the fleet, positioning herself to claim credit if the attack succeeded and deflect blame if it failed. She had been studying naval tactics obsessively since losing command authority, determined to prove her military value matched Ulick's. The battle began well. Sith forces emerged from hyperspace in overwhelming numbers, catching Republic defenders off guard. Krath war droids breached orbital stations. Massassi assault craft penetrated the upper atmosphere. Mandalorian fighters engaged Republic squadrons with lethal efficiency. But the Jedi had anticipated this attack, if not its timing. They had concentrated forces on Coruscant, specifically to counter a potential assault on the capital. Hundreds of knights joined the defense, their battle meditation coordinating Republic forces with supernatural precision. The battle that was supposed to be quick victory became grinding attrition. Hours stretched into days, casualties mounted on both sides. The Senate building was damaged, but not captured. The Jedi Temple remained secure, despite multiple assault attempts. What should have been a decisive triumph became bloody stalemate. And then Alima made her move. With the battle still raging, she withdrew significant portions of her fleet. Not a retreat exactly, but a repositioning that left Ulick's forces overextended and vulnerable. She claimed communication difficulties, said she was regrouping to prepare for a second wave assault. The truth was less charitable. She had arranged for Ulick to be isolated, surrounded by Republic forces with insufficient support to extract safely. If he died in battle, she would mourn publicly while celebrating privately. If he escaped, he would owe his survival to luck rather than her support. Either outcome served her purposes. Removing Ulick from the hierarchy or demonstrating his vulnerability, Republic forces recognized the opportunity. They concentrated their attack on Ulick's flagship, overwhelming its defenses through sheer numbers. His ship was boarded. Jedi Knights fought their way to the bridge. and Ulick found himself facing former colleagues who had once called him friend. The Jedi wanted him alive. They hoped imprisonment might lead to rehabilitation, that the Ulick they remembered could be recovered from the Sith warlord he had become. They fought to disable rather than kill, using techniques designed to subdue without permanent harm. But Ulick had no interest in capture or redemption. He fought with desperate fury, killing Jedi he had trained alongside, destroying those who had trusted him. The betrayals compounded as the battle raged, each life he took pushing him deeper into darkness. Exar Kun felt the disturbance through their force bond, felt Ulick's danger and Alima's betrayal simultaneously. He made his choice with characteristic decisiveness. Abandoning his portion of the assault, Kun led a strike team directly to Ulick's location. The rescue was spectacular and brutal. Sokan's Massassi warriors carved through Republic forces with alchemically enhanced strength. His own lightsaber work was artistry of violence, flowing movements that left bodies in his wake. He reached Ulick's position, extracted the captured warlord, and escaped back to his ship before Republic reinforcements could prevent it. The Battle of Coruscant ended in defeat for the Brotherhood. They had failed to capture the capital, lost thousands of troops, and revealed vulnerabilities that Republic strategists would exploit. But the immediate crisis for Sith leadership was internal rather than external. Kun confronted Alima aboard his flagship, while Ulick recovered from injuries sustained during capture. The conversation was brief and pointed. Alima denied any deliberate betrayal, claimed communication failures, and tactical miscalculation. Her lies were transparent but delivered with such conviction that proving her guilt would require effort Kun decided was not worth expending. "You will have one more chance," Kun told her coldly. "One more opportunity to prove your value to the Brotherhood. Fail, and your death will serve as example to others who mistake ambition for capability." The threat was clear. Alima had been placed on probation, her authority contingent on immediate success. She needed a victory significant enough to restore her position, dramatic enough to overshadow her betrayal. When Ulick regained consciousness, he was informed of Alima's actions and Kun's decision. He felt no surprise, only bitter confirmation of suspicions he had been suppressing. The woman he loved or thought he loved had tried to have him killed for political advantage. The realization should have broken something in him, should have prompted reflection about what he had become and the company he kept. Instead, it simply hardened what remained of his humanity into something crystalline and cold. "What is her assignment?" Ulick asked, his voice devoid of emotion. "Arsus," Kun replied. "We know the Jedi are evacuating their Great Library, moving artifacts and texts to secure locations. I want those materials destroyed, the Jedi knowledge base eliminated. Alima will lead the operation using the ancient Sith weapon we recovered from Naga Sado's ship." Ulick understood immediately. The Corsair, the ancient vessel that could trigger stellar detonations, was damaged almost to uselessness. Operating it was suicidal. Anyone who attempted to use its primary weapon would likely be consumed by the energies they unleashed. Khan was sending Alima on a mission designed to kill her, framing execution as opportunity. She would destroy Ossus and die in the process, removing the treacherous element from Brotherhood leadership while achieving a strategic objective. "She will suspect," Ulick said quietly. "Of course she will," Kon agreed. "But her options are limited. Refuse and I kill her immediately for insubordination. Accept and she retains slim hope of survival. Ambition makes people foolish. She will take the assignment believing she can somehow succeed where logic says she must fail." It was ruthless calculation delivered with perfect indifference. Kun was solving a personnel problem through murder disguised as mission assignment. The efficiency of it was almost admirable if one ignored the human cost. Ulick should have objected, should have defended Alima despite her betrayal. should have recognized that this kind of leadership through fear and expendable subordinates was exactly what the Jedi had warned against when he began his infiltration. Instead, he simply nodded, accepted Khan's decision as reasonable, acknowledged that Alima had become liability that needed removing. The man who had been Jedi Knight Ulic Qel-Droma would have been horrified by this response, but that man was gone, replaced by someone who calculated the value of human lives against strategic objectives and felt nothing when the math demanded death. Alima received her orders with the mixture of suspicion and desperate hope that Khan had predicted. She knew this was likely execution dressed as mission. She also knew that success would restore her position and potentially even elevate her beyond current status. The gamble was terrible, but refusing was certain death. She departed for the crime cluster in command of the Corsair and a small fleet of support vessels. Her last conversation with Ulic was brief and poisonous. She accused him of collaborating with Khun to destroy her. He denied nothing, simply stared at her with eyes that had gone cold and empty. "I loved you," she said. "Perhaps, truthfully, or as close to love as either of us can still feel. Does that mean nothing? It means you should have considered consequences before trying to have me killed," Ulic replied flatly. "Betrayal has a price. You are paying it." Alima left without further argument. What else was there to say? They had used each other from the beginning, manipulation disguised as affection. That it ended in mutual destruction was grimly appropriate. The Brotherhood continued its campaign with new commanders replacing those Alima had led. Mandalore expressed approval of the leadership change, noting that warriors who betrayed allies deserved death regardless of their political connections. The Massassi, incapable of complex thought, simply followed new orders from new voices. But the episode revealed fundamental instability in the Sith Alliance. They were held together not by shared ideology or genuine loyalty, but by force and fear. Remove Khun's overwhelming power, and the Brotherhood would fracture into competing factions within hours. The Jedi recognized this vulnerability. They began planning operations designed to exploit internal tensions, to drive wedges between Mandalorians and Krath, between Khun and his subordinates, psychological warfare to complement military campaigns. And in the Republic Senate, politicians who had been paralyzed by indecision finally achieved consensus. The Sith threat was existential. Half measures had failed. The time had come for total war, mobilization of every resource, deployment of every asset. The galaxy was about to burn on a scale that would make previous conflicts seem like border skirmishes. The Great Sith War was entering its decisive phase, where victory would be absolute and defeat would be annihilation. Neither side could afford to lose. Neither side could imagine compromise. The collision would be catastrophic, and when the dust settled, the galaxy would be fundamentally changed. Ulic stood in the war room aboard Khun's flagship, studying holographic displays of Republic force dispositions. He was planning the next assault, calculating acceptable casualty ratios, determining which worlds could be sacrificed and which must be held. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice still whispered that this was wrong, that he had become the thing he swore to destroy, that Master Arca would weep to see what his student had become. Ulic silenced that voice through practiced mental discipline, focused on objectives rather than ethics, on victory rather than virtue. The Jedi Knight he had been was dead. The Sith warlord he had become was all that remained. And if that transformation was tragedy, well, the galaxy was full of tragedies. One more barely mattered in the grand accounting. Alima Keto approached her mission with the desperate cunning of someone who knew she was being sacrificed, but refused to accept that fate. The Corsair was barely functional, its ancient Sith technology degraded by millennia of neglect. the stellar detonation weapon that Naga Sado had used during the Great Hyperspace War 1,000 years ago flickered and sparked, its containment fields unstable, its targeting systems unreliable. But the weapon still worked, early, and barely was enough for someone with nothing left to lose. Her assignment was straightforward, in theory. The Jedi were evacuating Ossus, moving the contents of the Great Library to secure locations before Sith forces could capture or destroy it. Millions of texts, artifacts collected over 10,000 years, holocrons containing knowledge from the Republic's founding. The loss of this material would cripple Jedi institutional memory for generations. Alima was ordered to prevent the evacuation by any means necessary. Exar Kun wanted the library destroyed completely, ensuring that no Jedi knowledge survived to rebuild the Order after the war. The Corsair's stellar detonation weapon could accomplish this by triggering a supernova in the nearby Kron cluster, creating a shockwave that would sterilize Ossus along with everything on it. The problem was physics. Using the weapon at the distances required meant Alima's ship would be caught in the expanding wave front. The energies that could destroy star systems would also vaporize anything within light minutes of the detonation point. It was a suicide mission, disguised as strategic assignment. Unless she could find a way to survive what should be unsurvivable. Alima studied the weapon systems obsessively during the journey to the Kron cluster. She was not an engineer, but she had learned enough Sith sorcery to understand that dark side techniques could sometimes accomplish what technology could not. If she could channel the force through the weapon, shape the detonation, control its propagation, perhaps she could direct the blast away from her position. It was desperately unlikely to work, but desperation was all she had left. The Kron cluster hung in space like a jewel box, dozens of stars in close proximity, creating a region of spectacular beauty and complex gravitational interactions. Planets orbited in figure-8 patterns between binary systems. Nebulae glowed with stellar wind from multiple sources. It was one of the galaxy's natural wonders, and Alima was about to destroy it. Republic forces had been chasing her fleet since it departed Crises. They knew something significant was planned but could not determine exact objectives. The Jedi who accompanied the pursuit fleet felt gathering darkness through the Force but could not pinpoint its source amid the cluster's complex energy patterns. On Ossus, the evacuation continued with desperate intensity. Every available ship was being loaded with materials from the library. Jedi worked alongside archivists and volunteers, prioritizing what could be saved and accepting that most would be lost. Master Ood Bonner himself had volunteered to remain behind, planning to merge with the library's structure and protect what he could through force techniques that would cost him his mobility permanently. Ulic and Exar Kun were approaching Ossus from a different vector, leading a strike force intended to raid the library for specific artifacts during the chaos. It was opportunistic pillaging rather than strategic objective, but Kun wanted certain texts that he knew were housed in the collection. None of them knew what Alima was about to do. Even Kun, who had ordered the mission, did not realize the weapon's true scale. He expected localized destruction, perhaps orbital bombardment that would collapse the library structure. He had no concept that Alima was about to unleash forces capable of rewriting stellar geography. The Corsair entered the Kron cluster with its weapon charged and ready. Alima selected a target star, one whose detonation would create a shockwave reaching Ossus in approximately 6 hours. Time enough for her to position herself optimally. Time enough to attempt her desperate survival strategy. She activated the weapon with hands that trembled only slightly. Dark side energy flowed through the Corsair's systems, centuries-old Sith sorcery responding to her commands. The weapon fired, not a physical projectile, but a concentrated pulse of force manipulation that struck the target star's core. For a moment, nothing happened. The star continued its normal fusion reactions, appearing unchanged. Then the core began to destabilize, collapse accelerating beyond natural rates. The star's outer layers, no longer supported by internal pressure, began falling inward. And then it exploded. The supernova was not natural. It burned with colors that did not exist in normal stellar physics, purples and greens that hurt to perceive. The explosion propagated faster than light through some mechanism that violated physics as the Republic understood it. This was Sith science, technology that treated reality as suggestion rather than law. Alima felt the detonation through the Force and reached out to shape it. She visualized barriers, channels that would direct the expanding energy away from her position. She drew on every technique she had learned, every scrap of power she possessed, trying to impose her will on forces that could sterilize planets. It almost worked. For a few seconds, she actually managed to deflect the shockwave, creating a pocket of relative safety around the Corsair. Her sorcery was sufficient for that minor miracle. What she had not anticipated was the chain reaction. The detonating star's energy struck neighboring stars, destabilizing them as well. Secondary supernovas erupted across the cluster, each triggering others in cascading devastation. What Alima had intended as single surgical strike became wholesale stellar massacre. The crime cluster was dying. A dozen stars exploding simultaneously, their combined energies creating a wave front that would sterilize everything within light years. And Alima's ship was in the epicenter with no possible escape. She realized her mistake in the seconds before her death, recognized that her attempt at survival had instead created something far worse than Kuan had ordered. She had not just destroyed Ossus, but 3 entire star systems. Billions would die, not from warfare, but from stellar catastrophe she had triggered through pride and desperation. Her last thought was not regret exactly, more like bitter acknowledgement that hubris had found its inevitable conclusion. The Corsair and everyone aboard vaporized instantly, consumed by energies that briefly outshone the galactic core. Alima Cato, co-founder of the Krath, student of Freedom Nad, seductress and manipulator and victim of her own ambition, ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. But her death was only the beginning of the catastrophe. The shockwave raced outward at faster-than-light speeds, giving no warning to those in its path. Republic ships pursuing Alima's fleet had no time to flee. They simply vanished, atomized by forces that rewrote matter into plasma and plasma into energy. On Ossus, the Jedi felt the disturbance hours before the shockwave arrived. They redoubled evacuation efforts, knowing that time had suddenly become desperately finite. Ships departed overloaded, carrying more than safety margins allowed, because dying in space seemed preferable to dying on the ground. Exar Kun and Ulic Keldroma arrived in orbit just as the Jedi realized what was approaching. They could see it through the viewport, a wall of light advancing across space like a visible tsunami. Everything in its path simply ceased to exist, matter converted to energy in an expanding sphere of annihilation. Kun's first instinct was strategic. The library's most valuable contents were still on the surface. If he landed quickly, grabbed what he could, and departed before the shockwave arrived, he might salvage something from this disaster. But looking at the approaching destruction, he recognized that timing was impossible. The wave was moving too fast. Anyone on the surface when it hit would die. Force sensitivity offering no protection against stellar energies. He made his decision, filled his ship's cargo holds with artifacts looted during the raid, and departed immediately, leaving his apprentice to handle the surface operation. Ulic watched Kun flee with something approaching admiration. The Dark Lord had assessed situation, recognized futility, and cut his losses without hesitation. It was perfect Sith philosophy. Survival above all else. Loyalty only when convenient. But Ulic was not ready to flee. Not yet. Something drove him toward the surface. Some need to witness what his choices had wrought. He landed near the Great Library, emerged from his ship, and walked into chaos. Jedi were everywhere, loading ships with desperate haste. Artifacts were being stacked without care for preservation, speed valued over safety. Master Rude Bana had already merged with the library's central tree, his body transforming into wood as he prepared to preserve what knowledge he could through Force techniques that would petrify him for millennia. And there, helping with the evacuation, was Kay Keldroma, Ulick's brother, the sibling who had tried repeatedly to save him from corruption, who had never stopped believing that the Jedi Knight he remembered still existed beneath the Sith warlord's exterior. Kai saw Ulick and his face transformed with desperate hope. He ran toward his brother, lightsaber forgotten, hands extended in greeting rather than defense. "Ulick, you came to help. I knew you were still in there. I knew the darkness had not consumed you completely." The joy in Kay's voice was heartbreaking in its sincerity. He genuinely believed that Uith had returned to the light, that the approaching catastrophe had shocked him back to his true self, that somewhere under the corruption his brother still existed. Ulick stared at Kay without speaking, looked at this manifestation of everything he had abandoned: innocence, trust, unconditional love, all the weaknesses that Sith philosophy taught him to despise. He should have embraced his brother, should have used this last moment before the shockwave arrived to reconcile, to express some fragment of remaining humanity. Should have given Kai the absolution he so desperately sought. Instead, Ulick ignited his lightsaber. "I am not here to help," he said, his voice empty of inflection. "I came to ensure the library's destruction, to verify that Alima succeeded even if she died in the process." Kay's expression shattered. Hope became grief, became desperate confusion. "No, you cannot mean that. You are my brother. You are Jedi. This is not who you are." "This is exactly who I am," Ulick replied. "The person you remember is dead. I killed him through choices made over months of corruption. There is no redemption, no return to light. Only acceptance that some falls are permanent." Kay refused to believe this, refused to accept that his brother was truly lost. He drew his own lightsaber, not in attack but in defense, positioning himself between Ulick and the evacuating Jedi. "If you have fallen so far, then I will stop you," Kay said, his voice breaking. "I will protect these people from you, but I will not kill you. I cannot." The duel that followed was brief and one-sided. Kay fought defensively, trying to disable rather than harm. Ulick fought with mechanical efficiency, every strike designed to kill. The outcome was never in doubt. Kay was good, but Ulick had always been better, and darkness had amplified the gap between their skills. Ulick's blade found its mark, pierced through his brother's guard, and struck center mass with lethal precision. Kay collapsed, lightsaber falling from nerveless fingers, dying but not yet dead. Ulick stood over his brother's body and felt nothing. No horror, no grief, no recognition that he had just committed the ultimate betrayal, just cold satisfaction that an obstacle had been removed. But then something changed. As Kai's life faded, as his presence in the Force began to dim, Ulick felt something crack inside himself. Not guilt exactly, more like sudden clarity, a moment of horrible lucidity where he saw himself as he truly was rather than as he had pretended to be. He had just murdered his brother, not in battle, not in self-defense, but in cold blood to prevent rescue, had killed the one person who had never stopped loving him, who had believed in him when everyone else had given up. The realization hit with physical force. Ulick dropped to his knees beside Kay's body, his lightsaber falling forgotten. He reached out to touch his brother's face, trying to offer some comfort, some acknowledgement of what had been destroyed. Kay's eyes opened briefly. He looked at Ulick, not with hatred, but with infinite sadness. "I forgive you, brother," he whispered with his last breath. "I always will." Then he was gone, presence in the Force extinguishing like a candle flame in a hurricane. Nomi Sunrider had witnessed the entire encounter from across the plaza. She saw Ulic murder Kay in cold blood, saw the man she had loved commit fratricide without hesitation, and something inside her broke. She reached out through the Force with power she had never wielded before. Rage and grief combined into a weapon more terrible than any lightsaber. She did not attack Ulic's body, but his connection to the Force itself, severing the bonds that made him what he was. The technique was forbidden, taught only as historical curiosity because it was considered too cruel for actual use. To strip a Force user of their abilities was to blind them, deafen them, make them less than what they had been. It was soul murder, leaving the victim alive, but fundamentally diminished. Nomi did not care about ethics in that moment. She wanted Ulic to suffer, to feel the emptiness he had created in others. She poured her pain into the attack, making it absolute and irreversible. Ulic felt the severing like a physical wound. The Force that had been his companion since childhood, the power that had defined his existence, suddenly went silent. He reached for it instinctively and found nothing. The universe became flat, dead, empty. He could not even sense Kay's ghost, could not feel his brother's presence in the Force where the dead sometimes lingered. The severance was total. Ulic had become mundane, ordinary, powerless. The shockwave arrived moments later. Ulic was still kneeling over Kay's body when the stellar energies struck Ossus. The library burned, ancient knowledge turning to ash. The forests ignited, entire ecosystems sterilizing under radiation that would make the planet uninhabitable for centuries. But the evacuation ships had departed, just in time. The Jedi who had been loading them escaped with their lives and a fraction of the library's contents. Master Udbana's sacrifice preserved some materials through Force protection that would survive even stellar catastrophe. Ulic should have died on Ossus, but Nomi, despite her rage, could not leave him there. She had him transported to her ship against the protests of other Jedi who thought he deserved abandonment. They fled the dying world moments before it became uninhabitable. Exar Kun watched from light years away as Ossus burned. He felt Alima's death, Kay's murder, Ulic's severing from the Force. The Brotherhood had achieved its objective. The Great Library was destroyed, Jedi knowledge base crippled, but the cost was higher than anticipated. His apprentice was now powerless, useless as military asset or Force practitioner. The Krath had lost its founder, and many of its leaders. The operation's success was strategic, but Pyrrhic. Kun made a calculation. Ulic was now liability rather than asset. The bonds Mark Aragnos had established required Force connection, and that connection was severed. The former warlord had no value anymore. He abandoned Ulic to whatever fate awaited, did not attempt rescue or contact, simply wrote off the investment and focused on consolidating what remained of the Brotherhood. The Great Sith War continued, but momentum had shifted. The Ossus catastrophe turned public opinion decisively against the Sith. Worlds that had been neutral declared for the Republic. Force users who had considered joining the Brotherhood reconsidered when they saw the scale of destruction. Even the Mandalorians began questioning whether this alliance served their interests. Ulic Qel-Droma, former Jedi Knight, former Sith warlord, now neither and nothing, was brought before the Galactic Senate to face judgment for his crimes. The trial would be brief. The verdict was never in doubt. But standing in the Senate chamber, stripped of the Force, staring at his brother's corpse in his memory, Ulic finally understood what he had become, finally recognized that every choice he made during the infiltration had been wrong, that the corruption had been complete long before he acknowledged it. He had set out to destroy the Krath from within. Instead, he had become their greatest weapon and worst victim, had murdered millions through commands he gave, had killed his own brother with his own hands. The magnitude of his fall was finally terribly clear. And there was no redemption possible, no way to undo the damage, no path back to the light that would not be mere performance. Some falls are permanent, some transformations are irreversible, some sins cannot be forgiven because the sinner no longer exists to receive forgiveness. Ulic had learned this truth too late. He would spend the rest of his life haunted by knowledge that came after the point where knowledge could matter. The galaxy would remember him not as the hero he intended to be, but as the monster he became, and that remembrance would be entirely accurate. The trial of Ulic Qel-Droma took place in the Senate Rotunda before representatives from 1,000 worlds. It was meant to be spectacle and closure, demonstration that even the most powerful Sith could be brought to justice. The prosecutors prepared extensive evidence of atrocities committed under Ulic's command. Witnesses traveled from across the galaxy to testify about horrors they had survived. Ulic offered no defense. He sat in restraints designed for Force users even though he no longer needed them, staring at nothing, speaking only when directly addressed. Kai's brother testified, unable to look at the man who had murdered his sibling. Nomi Sunrider sat in the gallery, her face composed but her eyes revealing depths of pain that testimony could not capture. The verdict was predetermined. Death by execution, sentence to be carried out immediately upon conclusion of the trial. No one objected. No one spoke in Ulic's defense except one voice that shocked everyone present. Qel-Droma's brother argued for mercy, not because Ulic deserved it, but because K would have wanted compassion even for those who had fallen furthest. He cited Jedi philosophy about redemption being always possible, about the importance of hope in the darkest circumstances. The Senate overruled him. Justice demanded consequences. The galaxy required closure. Ulic Qel-Droma would die for his crimes. And then Exar Kun arrived. The Dark Lord of the Sith materialized in the Senate chamber through Force technique that bypassed all security. He appeared flanked by Massassi warriors whose presence caused panic in the galleries. Lightsabers ignited across the floor as Jedi responded to the threat, but Kun made no aggressive moves. "I claim what is mine," he announced, his voice echoing through the sudden silence. "Ulic Qel-Droma is my apprentice, bound to me through oaths witnessed by Sith Lords dead 1,000 years. You have no authority to execute him." It was legal theater. Kun had no intention of rescuing Ulic out of loyalty or affection. He had abandoned his former apprentice after Ossus, written him off as lost asset. But the trial was being broadcast across the galaxy, and Kun recognized opportunity for demonstration. The Republic had dared to judge a Sith in their courts, to claim jurisdiction over those who served darkness. Kun would show them how foolish that presumption was. Jedi Masters moved to intercept Kun, but he paralyzed them with casual Force manipulation, not killing them, just demonstrating that their power was insufficient against his mastery. One by one the defenders froze in place, unable to move or speak. Then Kun reached for Ulic, intending to transport him through the Force to safety, and discovered that the severed apprentice was immune to his techniques. Without Force connection, Ulic could not be manipulated through the Force. The very thing that made him useless also made him untouchable by Kun's primary abilities. For a moment, the Dark Lord considered killing Ulic himself rather than allowing the Republic that satisfaction. But movement in the corner drew his attention. An elderly Jedi Master, moving with the careful deliberation of great age, approaching from behind. Vodosiosc Bas, Kun's former teacher, the master he had studied under before falling to darkness. The one being in the galaxy whose opinion still mattered on some level Kun barely acknowledged. "Exar," Vodo said softly, "you do not have to continue down this path. Power is not worth what it costs. I have seen what you have become. Let me help you find your way back." Kun laughed, but the sound carried less certainty than before. "You were always weak, Master, afraid of true strength, believing that compassion was virtue rather than limitation." "I was afraid," Vodo agreed. "Afraid you would fall exactly as you have. Afraid I failed you as a teacher. But fear does not make truth false. You have destroyed yourself chasing power. There is still time to stop." It was possibly the worst timing for intervention. Kun stood in the Senate chamber, having just demonstrated his superiority over every Jedi present. His ego was inflated by easy victory, and here was his former master, offering redemption as if Kun were some confused apprentice rather than Dark Lord of the Sith. The rage came instantly and completely. Kun ignited his lightsaber and struck Vodosiusk Bards down without hesitation. Cut down his former teacher in the center of the Republic's government, demonstrating that sentiment was weakness and mercy was foolishness. Vodo fell without defending himself. Perhaps he could have blocked the strike. Perhaps he chose not to. Either way, he died, looking at his former student with expression of infinite sadness. The murder broke whatever paralysis had frozen the Jedi. They attacked simultaneously, coordinating through battle meditation, using techniques designed specifically to counter Kum's abilities. They had learned from previous encounters, adapted their tactics, prepared for exactly this scenario. Kun fought his way to the exit, Massassi warriors dying to cover his retreat. He escaped back to his ship, fleeing Coruscant with Jedi pursuing. He had come to demonstrate Sith dominance and ended up fleeing for his life. The humiliation stung worse than any physical wound. But he had achieved one objective. Ulic remained in Republic custody, but Kun had proven that Sith could strike at the government's heart whenever they chose. The psychological impact of that demonstration would resonate for years. The trial concluded in chaos. Ulic was sentenced to death, but security concerns prompted postponement of execution. He was transported to maximum security facility to await a new date for punishment. Except he never arrived at that facility. During transport, Ulic's ship was intercepted, not by Sith forces, but by something unexpected. A small group of Jedi who believed that redemption mattered more than revenge, that Kai's message of forgiveness should be honored. They freed Ulic from custody and took him not to safety but to confrontation, brought him to Yavin 4, where Exar Kun had retreated after the disastrous Senate raid, forced him to face the Dark Lord he had served, to witness what his choices had empowered. Ulic, powerless and broken, stood before Kun and offered information he should never have possessed. The exact location of Kun's stronghold, the distribution of his forces, the vulnerabilities in his defenses, everything the Republic needed to launch a final assault on the Brotherhood's leadership. It was betrayal motivated, not by strategy, but by guilt. Ulic wanted the war to end, wanted to stop the killing he had helped enable. If giving Kun's location to the Jedi meant his own death, that seemed like appropriate price. The Jedi listened to his intelligence and prepared their assault. A massive fleet, hundreds of ships, thousands of Jedi all converging on Yavin 4. It would be the largest concentration of Force users since the wars a millennium ago. Kun felt them coming and recognized that conventional victory was impossible. He could not defeat an army of Jedi with the forces at his disposal. The Massassi were powerful but not infinite. His Sith techniques were formidable but not invincible. He needed something dramatic, something that would ensure his survival and devastate his enemies simultaneously. And so he turned to the most forbidden technique in Sith archives, a ritual that had been attempted only twice in recorded history. Life transfer on a massive scale. The complete draining of every living being on Yavin 4 to fuel a transformation that would separate Kun's spirit from his body. He would become pure Force entity. impossible to kill, because he would no longer be alive in any conventional sense. The ritual required sacrifice, the death of thousands to fuel one ascension. Khun did not hesitate. The Massassi had served their purpose. Their final contribution would be their life force, drained completely to power his transformation. When the Jedi fleet arrived in orbit, they found Yavin 4's forests burning. The Massassi temple stood empty, their inhabitants reduced to desiccated husks, and Khun himself was nowhere to be found, his presence diffused throughout the moon's structure rather than concentrated in flesh. The Jedi recognized what had happened. Khun had attempted transcendence, had succeeded partially, but was now trapped rather than freed. His spirit was bound to the temple complex, unable to leave or fully manifest. He existed in painful limbo, neither dead nor truly alive. They could not destroy him in that state, could not reach him through conventional means, so they created a force barrier, a wall of light that would contain his spirit indefinitely. Yavin 4 became a prison for a Sith Lord who had sacrificed everything for power and gained only eternal imprisonment. The Great Sith War ended not with dramatic conclusion, but with exhausted collapse. The Brotherhood's leadership was destroyed or scattered. Khun was trapped. Alec was powerless. Alime was dead. The Krath fractured into competing factions that could barely govern the territories they controlled, let alone expand into new conquests. The Mandalorians withdrew, concluding that this alliance had not provided the glorious combat they had sought. They returned to their own space, satisfied with individual honors, won but disappointed in the war's overall trajectory. Republic forces began the long process of reclaiming occupied territories. It would take years to fully restore government authority, decades to repair the damage, generations to heal the trauma. But the existential threat was gone. The Sith had been defeated, not through heroic combat, but through their own internal contradictions and the inevitable collapse that follows when darkness consumes itself. Ulic Qel-Droma lived through all of this as witness rather than participant. Powerless, stripped of everything that had defined him, he wandered the galaxy, searching for purpose in a life that had become hollow. The Jedi offered him no welcome. The Republic wanted him dead. Former allies had betrayed or abandoned him. He eventually found himself on Renvar, a frozen world on the edge of known space. There, he built a small shelter and attempted to live in isolation from the civilization he had nearly destroyed. Years passed. The war became history. New conflicts arose to occupy galactic attention. And then one day, a visitor arrived. A young woman seeking Jedi training, sent by her mother to learn from the legendary Ulic Qel-Droma. Except the legends had not mentioned his fall, his corruption, his redemption through suffering. Her name was Vima Sunrider, Nami's daughter, the child of the woman who had severed Ulic from the Force. He should have sent her away, should have told her that he was not the teacher she sought, that he had nothing to offer except cautionary tales about how corruption progresses. But Vima insisted, and something in her determination reminded him of Kay's faith that goodness could survive even the darkest night. Ulic agreed to teach her, not through force techniques he could no longer demonstrate, but through philosophy and hard-won wisdom about darkness and light. He passed on lessons learned through tragedy, hoping that his failures might prevent someone else's fall. It was small redemption, insufficient to balance the evil he had done. But it was something, a fragment of light in the vast darkness his choices had created. Years later, a spacer named Hogun arrived on Renvar. He had heard stories about the famous Sith Lord living in isolation and wanted to kill him, to become known as the man who had ended Ulic Qel-Droma. Fame through assassination, glory purchased with murder. Hogun shot Ulic in the back while he stood watching a sunset. killed him without ceremony or final words. It was anticlimactic ending for someone whose story had shaped galactic history. But as Ulic died, something unexpected happened. His connection to the Force, severed years ago by Nomi's rage, suddenly restored. In his final moments, he felt everything he had been denied, felt Kay's presence welcoming him, felt the light he had abandoned, offering forgiveness he did not deserve. He died at peace, reconciled, not through earning redemption, but through accepting grace he could never have earned. The galaxy remembered Ulic Qel-Droma as villain and victim simultaneously. His story became cautionary tale told to young Jedi about the dangers of infiltration, about how darkness corrupts gradually, about how the fall can happen to anyone regardless of strength or training. The Krath faded into history as well. Some remnants survived in the Outer Rim, maintaining their practices in secret, but the cult never regained its prominence, never threatened the Republic again. It became footnote in history texts, example of how dark side movements rise and fall with destructive regularity. Exar Kun remained imprisoned on Yavin 4 for 4,000 years, his consciousness trapped in temples that would later house the rebellion against another empire. His story would be rediscovered and his techniques studied by new generations seeking power without wisdom. The cycle would continue. Darkness would rise, heroes would fall, the galaxy would burn and rebuild. Over and over, the same patterns repeating, because each generation believed it would be different, that they would succeed where predecessors failed. The Great Sith War was over, the costs were tallied, the dead were mourned, and the galaxy moved forward, carrying scars that would never fully heal, but determined to survive despite them. In the end, that persistence was perhaps the real victory. Not the defeat of any particular enemy, but the refusal to surrender to darkness even when darkness seemed overwhelming. The choice to rebuild rather than abandon hope. The decision that tomorrow could be better even when today was terrible. Those choices made civilization possible, made progress conceivable, made redemption, however incomplete, at least imaginable. And sometimes, imagination is enough. 4,000 years have passed since the Krath rose and fell. The Empress Teta system still exists, though few who live there now remember the darkness that once consumed their worlds. The crystal towers of Sinagar still catch the light in prismatic displays. The carbonite industry still drives the economy. Life continues as it always has, resilient and persistent despite catastrophe. The Iron Citadel was torn down within a decade of the war's end. The citizens demanded it, needed to erase the physical reminder of horrors committed within its walls. A memorial stands in its place now, simple stone listing names of those who died during the Krath occupation. Thousands of names carved in marble that weathers slowly under Sinagar's gentle rains. Tourists visit sometimes, students studying history, families honoring ancestors who resisted or suffered. They stand before the memorial and try to imagine what it was like when darkness ruled openly. Most cannot. The horror is too distant, too extreme to feel real. It becomes abstraction, numbers in textbooks rather than individual tragedies. Perhaps that distance is necessary. Perhaps we must forget specifics to move forward, keeping only general lessons about vigilance and the fragility of civilization. Remember too much, and trauma becomes inheritance, poisoning generations who bear no responsibility for ancestral sins. But some things deserve remembering. Some warnings matter too much to let fade into comfortable obscurity. The archives I have been reading from will be sealed again when my research concludes, returned to restricted access, available only to Jedi historians and Republic officials with appropriate clearance. The Krath story is considered too dangerous for general knowledge, too detailed in its documentation of Sith techniques that could corrupt new generations of Force users. I understand the reasoning but question the wisdom. Ignorance does not prevent darkness. It only ensures we face familiar threats without recognizing them until too late. The Great Jedi Library on Ossus never fully recovered from the destruction. Master Udbina preserved what he could through sacrifice that left him petrified for millennia, but most of the collection was lost. Knowledge accumulated over 10,000 years of Republic history, gone in hours because two young nobles became bored and sought meaning in forbidden places. That loss echoes still. The Jedi Order that exists in my time is diminished from what came before. We have fragments of techniques, partial understanding of force applications, incomplete philosophical frameworks. We rebuild as best we can, but foundation stones are missing. The Krath's temples were also destroyed, systematically dismantled by Republic forces who wanted no trace of their corruption remaining. But dark side energy does not dissipate easily. The locations where those temples stood remain tainted, places where the force feels wrong, where reality seems slightly twisted. Travelers avoid them instinctively even when they cannot articulate why. On Yavin 4, Exar Kun's prison endures. The Massassi temples still stand, empty but not abandoned. His spirit remains trapped within their walls, conscious but unable to affect the physical world beyond subtle manipulations that might be imagination. The Jedi maintain their containment barrier, refreshing it periodically to ensure the Dark Lord's imprisonment continues. Sometimes I wonder if consciousness without escape is crueler than death, if Kun's eternal imprisonment is justice or torture. But then I remember what he did to achieve that state. The thousands of Massassi he drained of life, the apprentices he corrupted, the civilizations he helped destroy. Perhaps there are crimes so severe that mercy becomes injustice to their victims. Ulic Keldroma's grave on Renvar receives occasional visitors. Jedi come to pay respects, to meditate on his story, to remember that even the strongest can fall if they lose sight of fundamental truths. Some leave offerings, flowers that freeze instantly in the planet's cold. Others simply stand in silence, processing their own fears about darkness within. His story is taught to every Jedi initiator's cautionary tale. The infiltrator who became the infiltrated. The hero who transformed into villain. The warning that good intentions provide no protection against corruption if we expose ourselves to darkness believing we are immune. I wonder what Ulic would think of his legacy. Would he accept that his fall serves purpose by preventing others? Would he consider teaching through negative examples sufficient redemption for atrocities committed? Or would he argue that nothing justifies the pain he caused, that learning from tragedy does not erase tragedy? These questions have no answers. Ulic is dead, beyond interrogation. All that remains is his story, told and retold, details shifting slightly with each generation until fact and legend become indistinguishable. Nomi Sunrider lived a long life after the war. She eventually became Grand Master of the Jedi Order, leading with wisdom earned through suffering. She never spoke publicly about Ulic or their relationship, maintaining dignified silence about pain too personal for public consumption. Her daughter Vima, trained partially by the man who had killed Nomi's friends and corrupted her ideals, became a Jedi Knight of notable skill and compassion. Perhaps that is the real triumph, that even from destruction, something good can grow, that tragedy can produce wisdom that prevents future tragedy, that the cycle of darkness rising and falling ultimately bends toward light if we refuse to surrender to despair. The galaxy continues its rotation around the galactic core. Stars are born and die. Civilizations rise and fall. Patterns repeat with minor variations, each generation believing their struggles are unique, while reenacting dramas as old as consciousness itself. The Sith will rise again. They always do. Some new incarnation will discover old techniques, embrace familiar philosophies, promise power without limitation. and once again, the Republican Jedi will mobilize to stop them. The conflict is eternal, built into the fundamental tension between selfishness and service, between power and responsibility. But knowing the cycle continues does not make individual battles meaningless. Each generation must make its own choices, must decide whether to resist darkness or embrace it, must determine what values justify sacrifice and what compromises corrupt beyond recovery. The Krath made their choices. Uslima and Satul chose forbidden knowledge over safety. Ulic chose infiltration over patient strategy. Exar Kun chose power over humanity. Each decision seemed reasonable at the time. Each step down the path felt justified. And collectively, those choices led to catastrophe that killed millions and scarred the galaxy for generations. We cannot prevent people from making similar choices in the future. Free will guarantees that darkness will always find willing servants. But we can remember, we can teach, we can maintain archives and tell stories and preserve warnings for those willing to listen. And sometimes, rarely, those warnings prevent tragedy. Sometimes someone stands at the threshold of corruption, remembers what happened to those who crossed it before, and turns back. Those victories are quiet, unmarked by celebration, because the disaster never occurs, but they matter as much as any military triumph. I am finishing my research now. The data cards will be returned to their sealed containers. The holocrons will be locked away. This archive will close, and with it, detailed knowledge of exactly how the Krath corrupted an entire star system. Future historians will have to petition for access, explain their research purposes, submit to security screening. But I have learned what I came seeking. Understanding of how darkness spreads, how corruption progresses, how good people become monsters through choices that seem minor at the time. That knowledge will inform my teaching, shape how I train the next generation of Jedi, provide context for warnings about paths that should not be walked. The Empress Theta system sleeps peacefully tonight. Its citizens do not dream of frozen corpses hanging on palace walls or public executions that entertained crowds. They are not haunted by memories of war droids designed to kill Jedi or temples radiating corruption. The past is distant enough to feel unreal. Perhaps that is as it should be. Civilizations cannot function if trauma remains fresh across generations. We need distance to heal, space to rebuild, time to transform tragedy into lesson rather than continuing wound. But in quiet moments, in archives like this one, in stories told to young Jedi learning their place in an ancient order, the memory persists. The Krath happened. Real people suffered real consequences, and the choices that led to their suffering remain available to every generation. Will we choose differently? Will we learn from predecessors' failures? Will we recognize corruption before it becomes complete? These questions have no certain answers. History suggests we will make similar mistakes, that each generation must learn through its own suffering, because wisdom cannot be inherited, only earned. But perhaps each cycle the learning comes slightly faster, the recognition slightly earlier, the damage slightly less severe. Perhaps that gradual improvement, measured across millennia rather than years, represents the real arc of galactic history. Not dramatic triumph of light over dark, but slow, painful, incomplete progress towards civilizations that can resist corruption more effectively than their ancestors. I choose to believe this, not because evidence supports it definitively, but because belief shapes action. If we think progress is possible, we work toward it. If we surrender to cynicism about human nature and corruption's inevitability, we guarantee that darkness will triumph. The Force flows through all things, light and dark existing in eternal balance. But balance does not mean equivalence. It means that both exist, both have power, both offer paths forward, and within that balance we choose. Every day, every moment, every decision about who we will be and what we will serve. The Krath chose darkness, chose it gradually through cumulative small decisions that felt justified in isolation. By the time they recognized what they had become, transformation was complete and reversal impossible. We can choose differently, can recognize the early signs of corruption, can step back from paths that lead to destruction, can remember that power without wisdom is not strength but foolishness, can honor compassion even when cruelty seems more effective. These choices are difficult. They require sacrifice, humility, acceptance that some problems cannot be solved through force. They demand we resist temptations that promise immediate results at cost of long-term values. But difficulty does not make choices less necessary. The crisis story, told across these many hours, illustrates what happens when we prioritize power over principle, when we mistake corruption for clarity, when we believe ourselves immune to darkness that has consumed countless others. Their fall warns us. Their suffering teaches us. Their choices offer contrast to show what we must avoid. And in remembering, in learning, in choosing differently, because we know what happened to those who chose poorly, we honor both the victims who suffered and the possibility that tomorrow can be better than yesterday. The galaxy turns, stars shine overhead. Somewhere, darkness gathers strength for another attempt at dominance. Somewhere else, light prepares to resist. The eternal conflict continues, as it must, as it will until time itself ends. But tonight, in this moment, there is peace. The Empress Theta system rests beneath familiar stars. The crises are memory rather than threat. The war is history rather than present horror. And that peace, however temporary, however fragile, however purchased through terrible sacrifice, is worth defending, is worth fighting for, is worth choosing again and again, despite knowing how difficult maintaining it will be. Thank you for journeying with me through this dark chapter of galactic history, for listening to stories of corruption and fall, of tragedy and loss, of choices that shaped civilizations for millennia. I hope the telling has been worthwhile, that the lessons resonate, that the warnings find fertile ground. May the Force be with you, wherever you are, across this vast galaxy. May your choices honor those who suffered to teach us. May your path remain bright, even when darkness surrounds you. And may you find, in the quiet moments before sleep, the peace that eluded so many in this story. The rest that comes from knowing we have done our best, chosen wisely, remained true to values that transcend expedience. Sleep well, traveler. The galaxy watches over us all. And tomorrow when you wake, the choice will be yours again. To serve light or darkness, to build or destroy, to honor the lessons of history or repeat its tragedies. I trust you will choose well. The stars are waiting. The Force is eternal, and the story always continues. Good night.